A young man sits across from a sharp-dressed older man with glasses, who grins and pushes a document toward him, urging him to sign without thinking twice. The young man stares at the pen in his hand, silent hesitation written across his face as he holds it over the paper. A woman nearby watches the two men talking and quietly wonders if the deal being discussed is actually safe. The young man snaps in frustration, protesting the pressure, while the older man slams a hand on the table and reminds him not to overthink it. The older man leans back, offering a wide smile and insisting he'd never scam an old high school friend, claiming he has already explained the guaranteed principal and compound interest details. He promises the young man's money will multiply, adding that this opportunity isn't something he shares with just anyone he called him, specifically because he was thinking of him. A memory surfaces. The young man recalls watching the older man take work calls at his own father's funeral and bowing to his boss there, saying it broke his heart to see him treated that way. The young man's expression tightens into a bitter smile, remembering how furious he'd felt when his father was brought up, yet he had been powerless to do anything about it. His hand moves across the signature line, hoping that the goodwill shown to him was genuine, since hope was the only thing he had left to hold onto. The older man removes his glasses, smirking coldly at having manipulated him so easily. 2 years pass. In the present day, a door creaks open into a dark, cluttered room. A young man clutches a toilet, retching violently, his body hunched over in the confined bathroom. He lifts his head, sick and exhausted, muttering that the snacks he'd finally treated himself to had just come back up. He is introduced as an ordinary 28-year-old man living in South Korea, stumbling through a messy apartment littered with bottles and papers, admitting his life falls far short of ordinary. He recalls that the man responsible for his downfall has been unreachable for a year, leaving him to barely survive, crushed under debt, with only 5 hours before his part-time job. He considers reading a little before sleep, the only hobby left in his decaying routine. He reaches for a worn black book on the shelf, the novel Dark Header, promising himself just 30 minutes. Lying on his bed, he flips through pages he has read over 100 times, the story somehow always feeling new. He calls it a small escape from a miserable life, even if only for a moment. Suddenly he freezes, eyes widening in surprise at something unexpected on the page. Strange purple, glowing black feathers drift outside the window, catching the man's attention as he sits at his desk, murmuring in confusion at the sight. He touches his face and notices blood trickling from his nose. Recognizing the feathers as those of a crow, a sudden cough forces more blood from his mouth. Catching him completely off guard, blood splatters across the pages of his book as it falls from his hands, staining the sheets beneath him. Gripping his chest, he realizes something is deeply wrong with his heart. Struggling to breathe, he collapses forward as dark purple energy begins swirling violently around the book on the floor. Blood drips from his mouth as he curses his misfortune, gasping through the pain. Sitting on his blood-stained bed, he questions whether this senseless end is truly how his life will conclude. Just as he begins to accept his fate, something stirs violently within him. In his final moment of clarity, the only image that surfaces in his mind is the face of the man who scammed him. Purple feathers scatter around his collapsed body as he admits, with regret, that there was nothing he could have done. A burst of black feathers rises into a night sky, revealing a masked figure with glowing blue eyes staring outward. Breathing heavily, he turns, startled, gripping the fabric of what looks like royal robes, wondering aloud what just happened, and whether it had all been a dream. A close-up reveals his eye has changed, gleaming an unfamiliar shade of blue as he questions where he now stands. He finds himself inside a grand chandelier-lit hall, demanding to know where exactly he is. His eyes widen with unmistakable fear as a sharp, threatening sound tears through the air behind him. Perched ominously on a branch, a massive crow-like creature glares down with piercing red eyes. Looking out through a window, he sees countless red-eyed crows perched across the bare trees beneath 3 strange-colored moons, letting out an exhausted sigh. One of the crows suddenly shrieks and dives straight toward him, sending him stumbling backward in shock. Cornered and desperate, he throws his arms up and screams for help, only to jolt awake on his bed, shaken and confused, wondering if the nightmare came from his recent lack of sleep. The crow lunges closer, its red eye burning through the dark as he begs desperately to wake up from what he prays is only a dream. Its claw brushes against his forehead, and he pleads again, eyes wide with disbelief at what he is seeing. Moments later, the same crow sits calmly against him, and he wonders aloud why the creature has suddenly turned so gentle. Without warning, the crow lashes out, diving at him with sharp talons extended. He looks up at a strange sky holding a red moon, a blue moon, and a small yellow star, realizing with dawning horror what this place might actually be. His reflection stares back at him, confirming that this world is nothing like the reality he once knew. A voice inside identifies him as Prince Ran-Abaran, spoken gently by someone named Anna. Summon a request to enter his chambers and he panics, scrambling to stop the door from opening while claiming he isn't feeling well. On the other side, a startled maid steps back, caught off guard by his reaction. He lies collapsed on the floor, groaning and clutching his aching head. A servant retreats after being told to come back later, while the man realizes with alarm that the name Ran-Abaran confirms his suspicions. Still dazed, he grips his head, piecing together that this place is likely the very novel he has read countless times before. He identifies the world as that of Dark Header. Now recognizing himself as the Empire's seventh prince, Ran-Abaran horrified. He remembers this character is fated to die a miserable early death within the story, screaming in denial at the realization. Sitting alone, he wonders how this could have happened. Stunned that of all people, he woke up inside this cursed novel. A composed aide named Sign arrives, formally announcing himself before the prince. He recalls that Sign is the seventh prince's loyal aide, reacting with surprise at seeing him in person. Sane and a young maid arrive together, explaining they came personally after hearing he had skipped dinner. Sane presents a prepared meal and gently asks whether the prince is feeling any better. Steadying himself, he resolves internally to stay calm and convincingly play the role of Abaran from now on. Standing before Sane and the maid, he assures them he is feeling somewhat better, prompting quiet relief from both. Sane instructs the maid, Anna, to set the table for the prince's meal, and she quickly agrees. As Anna serves the food, he studies the trembling girl and eyes the meal with visible suspicion, unsure if it is even meant to be edible. When he reaches to pour his own tea, his sudden movement startles her further. The pitcher tips and spills across the table, catching them both off guard. Anna's expression turns to pure horror at the small accident. She scrambles backward, panicking and repeatedly apologizing for the spill. He silently wonders why she is treating such a minor mistake like a catastrophe. Watching her continued distress, he questions why she is reacting as though it were some unforgivable disaster. He realizes the reason the body he now inhabits, Ran-Abaran, has a reputation as a scumbag. Memories surface of the prince's past cruelty, a man known for destroying property, lashing out violently, and even killing servants who angered him, making him infamous as the story's worst early villain. Sane interrupts the meal politely, apologizing for the intrusion, while noting how surprising it is that the noble prince had fallen ill. He adds that he is relieved to see the prince recovering, still holding on to his polished, courteous tone. Sane then presents a budget proposal, insisting it must be signed immediately since it concerns urgent matters. Internally, he dismisses the claim as nonsense, recognizing the manipulation, while wondering what real business a supposedly foolish, incompetent prince could ever be trusted with. Studying the documents closely, he identifies them as clearly fabricated, meant only to siphon away the prince's share of the funds. He realizes Sign's influence stems from being a relative of the empress, whose power extends throughout the entire empire. Despite recognizing the scheme, he knows the original prince was too foolish to ever have noticed, and hesitates over whether he must sign in order to stay consistent with the story. Sane mocks him openly, questioning whether royalty could really have forgotten how to hold a pen. Clearly enjoying the humiliation, fuming quietly at being disrespected despite his status, he questions why fate forced him into the body of someone so pathetic. As Sign presses further, insisting his need for guidance is exactly why signing is necessary. Pen in hand, he steadies himself, preparing to sign the document Sign has placed before him. Sane presses him again, urging him to stop thinking and simply sign without hesitation. The moment feels familiar, and he realizes this situation mirrors the exact scam that ruined his old life. He resolves firmly that he refuses to live that way again, letting the same trap repeat itself. Instead of signing, he questions Sign directly, pointing out that the math behind the proposal doesn't add up and calling it a clear waste of the budget. Sane reacts with surprise, admitting he hadn't expected the prince to think that far. Smirking, Sane pivots smoothly, suggesting he'll review everything again if the prince simply signs first, mentioning the meal getting cold. Sane presses once more, repeating his line about not thinking and just signing. Startled, the maid watches as something suddenly shatters and crashes to the floor. Sane's glasses lie shattered and soaked in spilled liquid, and he demands to know what happened, only for the prince to calmly claim his hand slipped. Drawing on his memorized knowledge of the novel, he reveals that Sign's connection to the empress is far too distant for her to even know he exists, shocking both Sign and the maid. Enraged, Sign lashes out and strikes him across the face. Bruised but defiant, he insists he doesn't know how he ended up here, but refuses to quietly accept the death that awaited him in the original story, twisting the blame back onto Sign for distracting him. Reflecting on his old life of being ignored and constantly losing, he declares he refuses to live that way. Again, resolving to use his knowledge of the novel and the prince's power to change his fate. Sane freezes in place, demanding to know why the prince has suddenly turned so bold. Calmly pointing at the ruined carpet, he simply states that it has gotten dirty. With cold authority, he orders Sane to clean it up himself, declaring with burning resolve that he will survive no matter what it takes. A golden light bathes an imperial hall as narration declares that the ruling family are treated as gods, their existence justified above all else. Silhouettes of golden-haired royals stand beneath the light, and the narration continues, praising their rare gifts and their radiant blonde hair as proof of divine right, a bloodline seen as untouchable and sacred. A steward with graying hair and a stern expression interrupts that praise. Adding one exception, the seventh prince is dismissed as worthless, unworthy of being counted among the golden royals. In a private study filled with scrolls and books, a black-haired young man reads a letter in silence. Around him, unseen voices mock his temperament and his dark hair, calling him a disgrace to the royal name. An older steward's face twists in anger as he rants about having wasted money and effort trying to secure a position, refusing to serve under someone he sees as beneath him, someone he considers a coward among the royals. The scene shifts to a grand room, where the black-haired prince sits calmly with a drink, while the ranting steward scrubs at the floor nearby, a young maid watching quietly from the side. The steward mutters about the humiliation of being made to clean, kneeling and wiping the floor before addressing the prince directly, reporting that the mess has been dealt with. Rising to leave, the steward's irritation boils over as he moves to storm off, knocking a cup from the table in his agitation, wine spilling across the polished floor. The prince responds by flinging something at him without warning, striking the steward and knocking him backward in shock. Coldly, the prince tells him that wasting time complaining is unacceptable and orders him to use the moment to practice more. A close shot reveals the prince's eyes have shifted to a striking red, his expression unreadable as he commands the steward to clean the mess up, then repeats the order more sharply, demanding he move faster. The steward, sweating and unsettled, remarks that the prince seems different than usual, admitting he doesn't know what to say when reporting to the empress. Walking away, the prince reflects privately irritated that a man who cannot even speak properly to the empress would dare try to threaten him. He decides he needs to make his position clear so the steward doesn't cause further trouble. Back in the room, the prince turns to a young maid and orders her to cover her ears. Startled, she stammers in confusion, unsure what he means. His tone turns darker as he warns her that what comes next isn't meant for someone like her to hear, threatening that if she listens in on even a single word, he'll have her working without the use of her fingers. Frightened, she quickly agrees. The maid clamps her hands over her ears, gritting her teeth and shutting her eyes tightly, bracing herself as the tension in the room rises. The prince stands in profile, his expression unreadable as a blurred exchange plays out around him, words too faint to make out, only the tension in his stance giving anything away. The steward's face fills the frame, sweat forming on his brow, his mouth open mid-response, replying to something said just as the exchange continues in muffled, obscured dialogue. The steward's face turns pale in an instant, his eyes wide and unfocused, as though he is staring at something lifeless, a corpse, rather than the prince standing before him. Later, outside in the palace courtyard, maids gather while washing linens, whispering among themselves about how the seventh prince has seemed different ever since that day, his behavior shifting in a way they can't quite explain. Beneath an open sky, the maids continue their conversation, admitting to each other that he has become far more frightening than before, one voicing quiet fear about whether they'll even survive to see the following year. Two maids scrub laundry near a well, quietly relieved that they haven't crossed paths with the prince recently, noting that he has been staying inside his palace instead of wandering the grounds. One maid, Anna, is startled when reminded that she is behind on her assigned cleaning duty, quickly acknowledging the mistake and rushing off to attend to her task. Inside a quiet library filled with stacked books, a passing thought notes simply that the weather outside is pleasant. The black-haired prince stands by a window holding tea, reflecting privately that mimicking the personality of the original seventh prince from the novel keeps him from drawing suspicion, though he notices the servants seem to avoid him out of fear. Walking down a dim corridor, he considers how a man named Sign no longer shows him disrespect and has kept his distance entirely since a certain incident, admitting he'd rather not have to throw another teapot at someone's head again. Sipping his tea calmly, he reasons that his relaxed attitude comes from knowing he still has time. with 1 year remaining before the original story begins and 3 years before his character is fated to die. A flashback shows a younger version of him sitting among towering stacks of books, engrossed in reading a worn novel titled Dark Header, a story he treasured so much he read it over 100 times after finding it tucked away in a local library. Back in the present, he smiles serenely with his tea, telling himself the story's true protagonist won't appear for a long while yet, so he might as well enjoy his remaining peaceful time. Gazing out at the sky, he remarks on how nice the weather is, musing that if he had wings, it might be pleasant to look down at the scenery from above. Suddenly, his expression shifts to shock as something unexpected overtakes him. His eyes wide with alarm, a teacup shatters violently, flying apart in fragments as an unknown force erupts around him. Gripping at his own body in panic, he cries out that something is happening to him all of a sudden, feeling as though he is burning from within. Struggling against the sensation, he notes that this feels different from anything he has experienced before. His entire body seemingly consumed by fire. Outside the door, Anna calls out to ask permission to enter the study for cleaning, unaware of the crisis happening within. Inside, he can only manage a desperate silent plea for someone to save him. Anna peeks into the room cautiously, relieved to find that he doesn't appear to be present. Unaware of what has just occurred moments earlier, believing the room to be empty, she steps in to begin sweeping, only to be startled when something shatters unexpectedly on the floor before her. Looking down with regret at the broken shards, she laments the loss, noting that if she had been able to sell the item intact, it could have fed her family for a month. A faint rustling sound catches her attention, causing her to pause and glance over her shoulder in confusion. A large crow with piercing red eyes suddenly bursts into view. Wings spread wide as it lets out a sharp cry, leaving her startled and questioning what the creature could be. Managing to catch the bird, she scoops it into her arms, scolding it gently for sneaking into the palace and warning that a very frightening person lives within these walls. A crow lets out a sharp cry, its red eye wide with something close to disbelief, as an internal voice mutters that it can't believe what is happening. Anna stands frozen, arms wrapped around the crow, questioning aloud whether the seventh prince has somehow changed into this bird, unable to understand why or how such a thing could happen. Anna admits she'd like to care for the crow if she could, but worries that if the real prince catches her holding it like this, they would both face deadly consequences. The crow suddenly reacts internally, realizing in horror that it is in fact that very prince. Panicking, the crow desperately tries to communicate, silently pleading not to be let go and insisting that this counts as a royal order. But Anna, unaware of the truth, tosses the bird into the air and tells it to fly far away. The prince plummets from the tower, screaming internally that he is going to die, his crow form spiraling helplessly through the sky before crashing toward the forest below. Mid-fall, he frantically wonders what he needs to do to survive, realizing through the panic that he might be able to use the wings now attached to his body. Fighting against the fear gripping him, he commands himself to fly, refusing to accept dying in such an undignified, accidental way. Struggling against the wind, he begs his own body to cooperate, repeating the plea to fly as he barrels toward the trees below. Just before impact, his instincts take over, wings spreading out as he reacts on pure survival instinct, uncertain what is happening to him. To his shock, he finds himself gliding steadily through the air, marveling that he is actually flying, before a new worry creeps in, whether he'll be able to turn back into a human again. Night falls over the palace, twin moons glowing softly above the domed rooftops as the scene shifts to later that evening. Back in his room, gasping for breath, he confirms with relief that he successfully reverted to human form, admitting he tested the transformation several more times just to be certain it wasn't a fluke. Catching his breath, he marvels that he seems capable of shifting into a crow purely through will, calling it an entirely unexpected ability he never knew he had. He questions where this power came from, wondering if it might be tied to a strange crow that had latched onto him on his very first day in this world, noting that nothing like this ever appeared in the original novel. Turning a doorknob quietly, he resolves that although he doesn't understand the origin of this ability, he must keep its existence a secret from everyone around him. Staring out a window, he considers how this unexplained power could complicate matters, since anything unaccounted for by the novel's plot has the potential to derail the story's intended progression. A servant's voice interrupts his thoughts, reminding him that the evening ritual is about to begin, and that he must prepare to attend, while he privately suspects the ability is somehow connected to a figure named Manus. Steeling himself, he acknowledges internally that the long-anticipated day has finally arrived. The scene reveals a monthly ritual where the emperor and his primary children gather for what is technically labeled a religious ceremony, though it functions as an unofficial succession test, one that notably excludes the seventh prince from consideration entirely. Standing at the far end of the hall, he reflects that witnessing this ritual firsthand feels entirely different from simply reading about it in the novel. Taking his designated seat at the very end of the table among the other royal siblings. In the grand hall, two royal brothers stood with shining blonde hair, drawing every eye. Beside their brilliance, the seventh prince looked as plain as a crow. A dark-haired young man stood among the royals, silent and composed. A voice cut through the air, calling him a half-witted bastard, who dared to hold his head up without shame. He recognized the one speaking, the eighth prince, Silos, Aberan, 17 years old, his half-brother by blood, but not by respect. Silos mocked him openly, questioning whether he had lost the ability to understand words. The dark-haired prince faced him without flinching, reflecting quietly that they were both minor figures who barely mattered in the grand story unfolding around them. Silos slammed his fist on the table, shouting and demanding a response, calling him deaf. The first princess stepped in, her tone sharp beneath its politeness. She reminded them that brothers should get along and warned against causing a scene before the emperor. Silos immediately backed down, apologizing to her with visible unease. The seating arrangement made the hierarchy clear. First prince, third prince, and second prince sat in careful order beside the first princess, each position reflecting their rank within the empire. Royal power came from something called manus, a unique force tied to bloodline. The brighter a royal's hair, the stronger their manus, marking them as true members of the ruling class. The dark-haired prince stood apart from all of them. His body, the one now inhabited by an outsider's consciousness, had been born with pitch-black hair and no manus at all. The only royal cursed this way. It explained why the original owner's personality had turned so bitter. Attention shifted toward the center of the hall, where a stone platform stood beneath a heavy curtain, the room's whispers falling into anticipation. The emperor's arrival was announced. Every royal bowed toward him. Above them, gold and dark hair alike bent low as the room fell into a tense stillness, the moment carrying both glory and the shadow of ruin. The emperor loomed at the center of it all, the highest power in the empire. He called for the ceremony to begin without delay. He revealed the ancient blue stone tablet, an artifact left behind by the first emperor, Prasa. It was said that when manus was poured into it, its true purpose would be revealed. The tablet's function became clear. It measured the strength of a royal's manus directly from their touch. When the emperor placed his hand upon it, a surge of light shot outward from the stone, extending across the hall as his enormous power made itself known. The light stretched all the way to the table's edge, drawing awed murmurs from the gathered royals. The dark-haired prince silently wondered whether the light had always reached that far or whether something had changed. The tablet's light dimmed, and a new hand was offered forward. A voice called for anyone who wished to challenge the result to step up. The dark-haired prince spoke, his voice steady. He declared that he would attempt it himself, drawing a surprised glance from another royal nearby. Tradition dictated that only the first prince usually took part in this ritual, since manus rankings, once measured, were rarely challenged or overturned by anyone else. The amount of manus reflected raw power itself, and it was well known that the first prince liked to display his strength periodically in front of the other royals, reinforcing his position. The first prince stood confident, his bearing radiating dominance. His display was meant to remind everyone present exactly who sat at the top of the hierarchy, and who was destined to become the next emperor. A choked sound escaped his throat as his expression darkened, eyes glowing faintly against the shadow covering his face. The first prince froze in shock, spinning around and shouting for his brother, his calm shattered in an instant. Blood streaked down his face as panic spread through the hall. Voices cried out for someone to find a doctor immediately. Amid the chaos, the dark-haired prince stood still by the window, rain pouring outside. He alone understood exactly what was unfolding before him. The first prince collapsed, blood pouring from his entire body, his life slipping away as death closed in fast. The screen turned dark red, marking the true story's beginning, signaling that everything before this moment had only been the setup. In this world, manus is a rare power that runs through the royal bloodline, though its form differs for each user. The first prince wields water manus, while the second prince commands fire, each ability shaping how they carry themselves at court. During the day's manus measurement, the first prince pushes out a stream of water, only managing to cover a little over half the testing table. Before the results can settle, he suddenly collapses, coughing blood in front of the stunned second prince and an attendant, both scrambling toward him in shock. A young man with dark hair looks on, sweating, realizing this isn't supposed to happen yet. In the original story, the first prince wasn't meant to cough blood for another 6 months, meaning the protagonist's arrival is still far off. Elsewhere, questions swirl around this same dark-haired man. Why can he transform into a crow when his original self in the novel had no manners at all? He studies his own reflection, unsettled by an ability the novel never described appearing right after he took over this body. He wonders if it is really just coincidence. The second prince, meanwhile, smashes his fist through a mirror in his room, frustration building as he mutters that everything had been fine that morning, and the day before had been ordinary too. His fist strikes again, shattering more glass, disbelief cracking through him along with the mirror. He drops to his knees, groaning in pain, his body shaking as something inside him seems to be breaking down. Gripping his own face, he realizes that every attempt to use Manus now sends burning pain through his whole body, and he fears he may have lost his power for good. Struggling to stand, the first prince insists this can't be happening to him. He is the Empire's first prince, the future emperor. He grabs his cane, snapping that he is different from the insects around him, certain of his own superiority. The second prince, unaware of what is coming, relaxes on a couch with a hookah, assuring himself his condition is nothing serious and that rest will fix it. A shadow suddenly appears near him, and he jerks around in alarm, demanding to know who is there. The dark-haired man watches calmly as the hookah pipe is destroyed, silently noting that this prince is a monster in raw physical strength. The second prince sneers at the intruder, mocking him as a powerless cripple unworthy of being sent as an assassin. The dark-haired man replies coolly that if he really were an assassin, the prince would already be dead, adding that he wasn't even noticed until he spoke. He points out the irony. Someone like him managed to slip into the emperor, to be's own bedchamber, one of the most heavily guarded rooms in the empire, without leaving a trace. The second prince demands to know how he got in and what trick he used. The intruder simply shrugs, claiming he climbed the outer wall, a claim as calm as it is unbelievable. The second prince scoffs, refusing to believe the story of scaling the palace wall from outside. The dark-haired man presses on, asking how the second prince's body has been feeling, noting that the royal physician likely found nothing wrong, but that he himself must know his own condition better than anyone else. The second prince lets out a short scoff, brushing off the question, then bursts into loud, mocking laughter at the whole situation. The dark-haired man watches him calmly, and remarks that he now understands, adding that the prince uses his head more than he appears to. The second prince's expression turns venomous, as he accuses the man of secretly poisoning him, planning to use it as leverage so he could keep his life once the prince becomes emperor. The dark-haired man cuts him off sharply, telling him that if that was his guess, he has gotten it completely wrong, and calls him a foolish little brother. He continues coldly, warning that within a week, the prince will be begging for death, with blood pouring from his eyes and ears. Startled, the second prince lunges forward with his hand outstretched, demanding to know what he means. The dark-haired man settles back casually, insisting he hasn't used any tricks or schemes at all. He explains further that the prince's body will keep deteriorating rapidly, and that eventually he'll die bleeding from his entire body, adding that even he himself doesn't yet know who is truly behind it. He leans in, telling the prince to listen carefully to what he is about to say. He states plainly that this is the prince's last chance to save his own life. Later, flying through the rain as a crow, the man reflects with relief that the prince turned out to be just as simple-minded and cowardly as he was written in the novel. He notes that the prince didn't even bother sending a single tail to follow him after he left the palace. Sitting alone afterward, he allows himself a moment of exhaustion, thinking that for now, he'll be able to use the prince however he wants. Soaring over the rainy capital, he muses that this crow ability is surprisingly convenient, letting him travel to far more places than he expected. A thought stops him mid-flight, since he is already out here, free and unnoticed. Maybe there is more he could do with this chance. He continues gliding silently over the sleeping city below, turning the idea over in silence. Back at the palace, a servant standing before a grand door remarks that the prince hasn't eaten in 2 days, worried by the lack of any movement from his room. Startled by the fear that something terrible might have happened, another maid panics, imagining harsh punishment for failing to protect a royal, and cries out in alarm. A servant panics as a fist slams into a wooden door, shouting in alarm that the prince might be in danger. The dark-haired man steps out, annoyed by the commotion, asking what all the noise is about, as a maid stumbles forward carrying a tray. He pulls the door open sharply, sending the startled maid crashing to the floor, along with her tray. The spilled contents splatter across the floor and onto his shoe, leaving a mess between them as she stares up in horror. Terrified, the maid drops to her knees, crying out that she has committed a crime worthy of death, insisting she only meant to check on him since she thought he seemed unwell. She stammers helplessly, unable to finish her sentence, distressed that she has caused a disturbance on top of everything else. He glares down coldly, asking how she intends to take responsibility for soiling the floor and his shoes. She begs desperately, saying she deserves to die but pleading for her family to be spared instead. He waves it off, telling her to forget it and just clean the mess spotlessly within 5 minutes before leaving. As she scrambles to comply, he adds a new rule. From now on, she is forbidden from approaching his private quarters, unless personally summoned, muttering to himself about not wanting to deal with any more annoyances or dramatic offers of her life. A month has passed since the first prince's mysterious nosebleed during the ritual, evidenced by scattered books and papers piling up around his desk as he searches for answers. A quiet rumor begins spreading through the palace. The first prince, the empire's next emperor, has lost his abilities. The dark-haired man reflects that to the other princes and princesses, this rumor signals a golden opportunity has opened up, in the original novel, to silence these rumors. The first prince urges the emperor to move up the timing of the hunting competition, despite it being scheduled for 6 months later. The man notes with some relief that events are still following the novel's plot so far, though he worries whether this disruption is confined to the capital or already affecting the protagonists elsewhere. On the day of the hunting competition, rows of soldiers and knights assemble before the gates as he privately hopes to cross paths with a certain person today so he can hand something over, planning to wait patiently for the right moment. A brash young man calls out mockingly, addressing him as nothing more than a bug. Riding alongside him, the same figure taunts that his black horse suits his gloomy personality, while the dark-haired man privately worries that this year, 1 full year before the novel's story begins, this rival seems far more hot-headed and impulsive than his novel counterpart. Choosing to ignore the taunt entirely since an important event awaits him, he rides on, prompting the furious rival to shout after him for ignoring him. Undeterred, he calms his black horse, remarking that he actually prefers it to a golden one, while another rider comments that the 7th prince at least seems to have a way with animals. Before the group finally announces their arrival, the group arrives at the entrance to the imperial forest, marking the true start of the hunting competition. Ahead stands the Tower of the Beginning, a massive rock spire where the opening ritual is held every year. The dark-haired man notes that once the first prince finishes performing the ritual, the hunting competition will begin immediately. The elderly emperor, aged and imposing in fur and armor, steps forward for the occasion. He reminds the first prince to prepare himself for the coming ritual, and the prince responds with practiced obedience, acknowledging his father's words. The second prince, walking beside his brother, remarks that he is glad to see him looking healthy and asks if he has decided on his wish yet, catching the first prince off guard as he questions what wish he means. The second prince clarifies that it is the wish granted to whoever wins the hunting competition, adding smugly that the first prince is obviously going to be today's winner. Anyway, obviously, the narration explains that the ritual exists to showcase the future emperor's manus, a public display of the royal family's strength, held in front of the gathered nobles. In the crowd, nobles murmur their excitement at finally witnessing the first prince's manus firsthand, though one voice quietly brings up a rumored incident, quickly hushed by another fearing they'll be overheard. Elsewhere, the second prince fumes, furious with himself for having trusted advice from someone he calls nothing more than a bug, warning that they'd better not have been lying to him. The dark-haired man watches from a distance with a faint, knowing smile on his face. Meanwhile, the second prince channels a surge of crackling energy, snarling that if he has been tricked, he'll make sure to kill the one responsible in the most agonizing way possible. Back near the crowd, the dark-haired man observes another young man standing rigid with nerves, teasing him lightly and telling him not to be so tense, addressing him as Reja. He reflects privately that as long as his instructions were followed properly, something interesting is about to unfold. A massive surge of blue mana tears through the sky as a robed figure stands at the center of a swirling vortex, arms raised, drawing power from every direction while a crowd watches from the shadows below. The storm collapses inward, sweeping across rooftops and cratering the ground as a lone figure is caught in the wreckage, flung through the debris while the shockwave rolls out toward the gathered onlookers. Streaks of energy slice through the rain-soaked battlefield, and a warning rings out to stay clear of the vortex. Moments later, the shockwave slams down and a man grunts in pain as he is thrown back by the impact. Amid the chaos, a dark-haired officer orders his men to retreat, his expression grim as he watches the storm intensify, refusing to say more than a clipped acknowledgement. At the heart of the surge, a young man declares himself the first prince, his eyes burning with conviction as raw power crackles around him, baring his teeth. He invokes two names, Reisha and Abaran, as the energy around him twists and surges with new intensity. He roars that he is the one destined to become emperor, thrusting his hand forward as a blinding orb of power erupts from his palm. The explosion tears upward through the sky, the shockwaves rippling outward as the figure hangs suspended at the center of the blast, arms outstretched. The energy climbs higher, still crashing against jagged rock formations, as two figures below raise their arms, channeling the storm toward its peak. The sky fractures with light as the surge reaches its climax. Crowds gathering below watch as the phenomenon builds to an overwhelming crescendo. When the storm finally settles, rain falls over a cluster of stunned soldiers, their faces pale and speechless at what they've just witnessed. A grizzled officer, decorated with medals, studies the aftermath and mutters that this is the menace of the royal family, awed by its scale. Elsewhere, a triumphant blonde man pumps his fist as the crowd erupts into cheers, chanting "Long live the first prince." Later, in a dim room, a young man is handed nothing but a plain stone and told to pour his manis into it, and he explodes in outrage, certain he is being mocked. The man holding the stone calmly explains that it can absorb polluted manis, adding coolly that refusing treatment simply means dying instead. Trembling with anger and fear, the blonde man grits his teeth as he is told there is no intention of saving him against his will. Riding through open countryside, the black-haired protagonist reflects that the item bought him valuable time, one meant for later in the story, and figures using it early won't cause any real problems. A servant staggers up a hill under a heavy strapped bundle, greeting the seventh prince nervously as he struggles with the weight. The servant explains he has brought the bag exactly as instructed, and the prince, seated and composed, simply asks if he has finally arrived. In a firelit room, a hooded figure turns with a sharp remark, accusing the servant of being unable to handle even a simple task, demanding to know if the bag was brought back untouched. A nervous, sweating aide with glasses guides a wild black horse, muttering to himself about how rough the animal is before admitting he brought it to the seventh prince. On purpose, a horn sounds twice across the open field, its deep call echoing through the grounds. A bearded, golden-haired noble raises his hand as the ritual horn finishes, marking the formal start of the event. A banner announces the royal hunting competition as rows of armored knights and nobles line up on horseback, ready to move. Several young competitors sprint forward on foot, arguing about their odds. One wonders if winning could earn him a wish from the emperor, but another dismisses the idea, certain the royal family will take the prize again. The seventh prince watches the crowd rush off and remains unbothered, noting privately that the competition means little to him right now. He considers staying low and avoiding attention. An older knight with gray hair marked by his medals and rank asks his companion Tolan for his opinion on the opening ritual, revealing his intent to track down the former imperial knight commander referred to by the name Agony Fetus. Tolan, a younger man in glasses, reacts with awe, calling the ritual truly the power of a god. The older knight remarks that watching the ritual made him feel as though the emperor meant to break the spirits of the gathered nobles. Tolan immediately panics at the comment. Tolan begs him to only say such things when they're alone. The older man brushes off the warning, insisting no one is close enough to overhear them. The gray-haired knight adds that there is a reason he has survived this long, at least for now. The prince rides his black horse deep into the imperial forest, checking a map as hoofbeats thunder beneath him. A caption explains the forest is split into 3 zones for the hunt. The map details the layout, a small animal zone near the entrance, followed by a medium zone, with the large animal zone lying farthest into the forest. A flashback shows a warrior kneeling before an emperor-like figure presenting the corpse of a golden fox. The narration notes this was only mentioned briefly in the original novel, leaving the exact location of the fox unknown. The narrator explains this uncertainty is why he had been scouting the vast forest from above in the form of a crow, searching for clues. Now back on the ground, the prince reasons through the clue about the original hunter washing his hands in water right after the kill, concluding the golden fox's location must be near a lake to the southwest. Riding hard through the trees, he decides to get ahead of a rival and wait for the right moment to strike, remarking that his horse sometimes seems to understand exactly what he is saying. Elsewhere, a young knight named Sign is relieved he managed to bring the required bag in time, thinking he worried for nothing and hoping to properly deliver it to Duke Agony Fetus. Suddenly, arrows streak past the horse's head as the rider ducks in alarm, the animal recoiling under the surprise attack. A heavy boot slams down onto the grass as a startled voice cries out, demanding to know what is happening, closing the sequence on the sudden ambush. The prince's black horse suddenly halts mid-ride, ears twitching. He asks if it is stopping because it is sick. He tries again, wondering aloud if the horse has spotted a beast nearby. A young man's eye narrows in dawning dread, muttering, "Don't tell me," as he senses what is coming. Riding alone through the trees, the prince questions whether the bag strapped to his horse is simply too heavy for it to carry. The horse plants its feet and refuses to move. The prince snaps at it, pointing out that other horses pull entire wagons, while this one struggles with just a bag and a rider. Gritting his teeth in frustration, he threatens to tell the stable master to starve the horse if it keeps acting so stubborn. A dark shape crashes down into the grass with a burst of leaves and dust hoofbeats echo through the forest as a second rider on a smaller horse closes in from behind. Staring at the reveal, the prince turns his back to the scene, quietly cursing his rotten luck. Watching the sunlight filter through the canopy, he reflects that catching a couple of wolves or deer should have been simple by now. Nearby, Talon trudges along carrying a heavy pack, remarking that luck clearly isn't on their side today. The older knight beside him says nothing. The gray-haired knight admits that he has gotten old too, having spent his whole life as a sword and shield for others. But time is something even he cannot defy. Tolan protests, insisting the man is already a legend and shouldn't speak that way. A flashback shows the knight in his prime, armored and drenched in the aftermath of battle, as he recalls his countless military exploits as Imperial Knight Commander exploits that now belong to a retired old man back. In the present, he asks Tolan if he has ever seen the royal family up close. Tolan admits he has only ever viewed them from a distance. Just like today, the knight tells him he'll understand once he faces them directly, promising he'll then see who the truly magnificent beings of the empire really are. The scene shifts to a black and white memory of a grand imperial capital, its cobblestone streets lined with carriages, as a voice describes the royal family as gods themselves, protected by his family for 1,000 years. In an old carriage, a father tells his young son that he has grown old and the boy must now take his place, urging him to always take pride in serving as a loyal house of the imperial household. The boy answers eagerly. The father points out the window, explaining that the merchant caravan passing by belongs to their family, proudly supplying goods to the imperial family. He continues the tour, noting that after this stop comes the temple. The carriage suddenly jolts as the horse rears back in fright. A servant cries out asking what is happening, while another apologizes profusely, explaining that something got caught in the wheel. Back in the memory, the father orders his son to get back inside the carriage, while a guard steps forward, promising to handle the cleanup himself. A body lies motionless on the stone street, limbs sprawled as the father stands over it in silence. Blood pools near the carriage wheel, streaking across the cobblestones where the accident occurred. The father studies the corpse and identifies it as a vagrant from the area, noting that the person appears to have been caught stealing imperial tributes from the temple. A shadowed figure looms within a distorted eye-shaped frame as the father dismisses the death, calling it a common sight around here. Back inside the carriage, the boy asks his father what is happening and says he wants to go outside too. The boy's father sharply orders him not to come out, startling the child. The boy quietly calls out to his father, only to be cut off as the older man insists he mustn't come out. Trailing off mid-sentence, the father's expression turns unreadable as he claims it is nothing at all. The scene shifts back to the present, where the aging duke watches the forest and privately notes that the dead vagrant's child couldn't have been older than 10. He continues the thought, reasoning the child must have been younger than his own son and was likely burned in the incinerator afterward, quietly questioning whether darkness exists even within such a noble empire. Tolan interrupts, urging the duke that they have no time to admire the scenery and must keep moving to save face for the family's name. The duke apologizes for the delay and reveals he knows a nearby spot where a golden fox has been known to appear. Elsewhere, the prince trudges through the forest under the crushing weight of his bag, gasping for breath and vowing to turn his horse into a roast once he gets back. He realizes that carrying the bag prevents him from transforming and worries about losing track of Duke Fetus while deciding whether to change back and return scouting. Earlier as a crow, he had already noted that even the small animal zone carries real danger, since a wild beast could appear at any moment. Rustling erupts from the bushes ahead, and he braces himself, wondering if something is finally emerging. Panicking, he curses under his breath, reluctant to abandon the bag, and regretting not bringing even a simple weapon, since it seemed like a hassle at the time. He shrugs off the fear, deciding he'll simply run if things get too dangerous, then spots something in the distance. a black horse charging toward him. The impact sends him flying, his scream tearing through the clearing as the horse plows straight into him. The prince stares in shock at the figure sprawled beside him, recognizing the hair color and stammering, in disbelief at who it might be. Elsewhere in the rain-soaked forest, the Duke calls out for Talon, asking what the noise was and whether he is alright. While a third figure crouches hidden among the bushes below, the prince lifts the unconscious Aide's head and realizes with growing dread that the blue hair belongs to Duke Fetus Aide, identifying him as Talon Krisa. Panicking, the prince clutches his bag and admits to himself that he is in serious trouble, having never expected to run into this man under these circumstances. A caption introduces the approaching figure as the former Imperial Knight Commander and war hero, shown mid-swing with his sword raised against the sky. The caption continues, naming him as Duke Agony Fetus, revealing that in the original novel, this man is destined to become the teacher of the story's protagonist, and the figure who will one day turn the entire empire upside down. In the depths of the forest, Duke Fetus advanced with his sword drawn, calling out the name, Agony Fetus. Hidden behind a thick tree trunk, the seventh prince froze in place, sweat on his brow. Realizing he could not afford to be seen by the Duke here, the prince recalled his plan. He had intended to wait near the golden fox's habitat, holding the dead fox as bait. When Duke Fetus arrived, the prince would accuse him of trying to steal a royal's hunting prize. From there, the prince planned to hand down an unreasonable punishment, forcing the Duke's aide, Tolan, to carry a heavy sack of stones throughout the competition. In his mind, that alone should have settled the matter cleanly, but the plan collapsed. Rain poured down as the prince clutched his chest, panicking, admitting to himself that everything had spiraled far beyond his control. Elsewhere, Duke Fetus knelt over a heavy stone lying in the grass, studying it closely. He noted its unusual weight and suspected it had been thrown deliberately. Standing among the trees, the Duke considered the possibility that the stone had not been meant for Talon alone. He wondered aloud whether an assassin had been targeting him directly. Nearby, Talon lay sprawled on the ground, injured and disoriented, weakly calling out for the Duke. The Duke rushed to his side, urging Talon to regain consciousness and share anything he could remember about the attack. Watching from hiding, the prince reflected on the weight of the situation. The Fetus family had guarded the royal bloodline for over 1,000 years and stood as the most powerful house in the empire. He was already regarded as the least capable of the princes, and he understood that if word spread he had attacked Duke Fetus, his position would become unsalvageable. Talon, still dazed on the ground, struggled to piece together fragments of what he had witnessed. The prince's panic deepened. Rain streaked down his face as his thoughts spiraled, repeating the same desperate question of what he should do next. A wound was visible on Talon's neck, the injury more serious than it first appeared. He apologized to the Duke, explaining that the attack had happened too suddenly for him to react. The Duke accepted the explanation for the moment, telling Talon to speak up if any details came back to him. As he turned, his expression sharpened with suspicion. A close, hardened look crossed the Duke's face, his eyes narrowing as if sensing something was being concealed nearby. Seizing the opening, the prince bolted from his hiding place, gritting his teeth and telling himself this was his only chance to escape. Duke Fetus reacted instantly, sword in hand, ordering Talon to wait as he took off in pursuit, vowing to catch the attacker himself. The prince ran without pause, his stamina draining fast, cursing the added burden of the heavy bag strapped to his back as he fled through the trees. Slowing for a breath, he questioned whether he had finally put enough distance between them, convincing himself that outrunning an old man should be simple. That confidence shattered the instant Duke Fetus appeared right behind him, blade raised, moving with a speed that defied his age. The prince realized, with dread, that the Duke had never truly retired. Cornered, the Duke demanded answers, questioning whether the prince was an anti-imperialist or a member of some hidden cult. The prince refused to disclose himself, warning that no one could escape Agony Fetus. Sprinting further into the rain-soaked path, the prince understood that capture was closing in fast. Still sprinting through the forest, the prince questioned whether he had any option left besides ditching the heavy bag and transforming into a crow to escape faster. He cursed his luck, wishing he still had the black horse that had abandoned him earlier. He decided against transformation for a moment, choosing instead to keep running on foot as fast as his legs allowed. His shape blurred mid-motion, dark feathers replacing his outline as he pushed himself to move faster than before. The transformation completed in a burst of motion, his human form giving way entirely to something faster and lighter. Behind him, Duke Fetus noticed the sudden shift, confused that his target had somehow gained speed and changed shape right before his eyes. The Duke pressed forward regardless, blaming his aging eyesight for the strange sight, refusing to let frustration slow his pursuit. After tearing through the underbrush and snapping fallen branches in his path, the Duke finally stopped in an open field, breathing hard, uncertain if he had lost his target for good. In the sky above, the prince felt his body grow strangely light, wondering if he had turned into a crow again, though the sensation of running never fully left him. The rhythmic sound of hooves striking the ground echoed nearby, and he wondered if the same black horse from before had returned. A reflection of sky and trees shimmered in a wide, alert eye, and the prince began to suspect something else was happening to him. He looked down to see he had become the horse itself, rearing on its hind legs, and could only think that the whole situation had turned absurd. Footsteps approached through the dark brush, and two figures in white royal uniforms arrived. One of them marveled aloud, asking his companion if he had truly caught such a creature himself. The pair stood facing a massive cave, like shadow, and one turned to ask why his brother seemed to find it so hard to believe. The two princes stood together as one confirmed that his brother had won the hunting competition, then asked what wish he intended to request from the emperor. A sly smile crossed the winning brother's face as he admitted he already had something specific in mind. Meanwhile, deep in the woods, the seventh prince slumped exhausted at the base of a towering tree, letting out a long breath of relief. Reality caught up with him fast, and he buried his face in his hands, realizing just how badly his situation had turned. He remembered with dawning horror that he had lost the bag somewhere during his escape. Nearby, two of his men writhed on the ground in matching panic, one shouting that they had lost the most important item, insisting there had to be a limit to how badly things could go wrong. Lying back in the grass, the prince stared up blankly, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and defeat as the weight of the disaster settled in. Alone in the woods, the prince told himself that standing around agonizing would change nothing. He decided the only sensible move was to retrace his steps and check what had happened to the bag. Nearby, Tolan sat propped against a tree, still dazed, and stirred when he noticed Duke Fetus approaching, greeting him with surprise. The Duke asked if his head felt any better. Tolan admitted he was mostly fine, though still a little dizzy from the earlier blow. The Duke's focus shifted to what mattered more. He confessed with visible frustration that he had let his target slip away, unsure if the man had simply been fast, or if his own age was finally catching up with him. Tolan pointed toward a bag sitting nearby, mentioning that he had picked it up on his way back after finding it dropped in the grass. He noted it looked expensive for something left lying around, and questioned why on earth it was stuffed full of stones. From nearby, the seventh prince kept his composure, claiming he had no idea, suggesting it might have simply been someone's prank. Before he could finish the thought, Duke Fetus turned sharply, immediately recognizing the bag and closing the distance toward him with Tolan at his side. Startled, the aide pointed straight at the prince, blurting out his identity in shock. Both the Duke and Tolan dropped instantly into a respectful bow, greeting the seventh prince with visible unease. Recovering first, the Duke asked cautiously whether the bag belonged to him. The prince answered simply that he had been wondering where it disappeared to. Tolan's suspicion sharpened. He asked pointedly why his own item was found near the bag, demanding to know if the prince had stolen it from him. The Duke stepped in with mild offense, calling the accusation absurd, insisting he had merely come across the bag by chance while walking through the grass. The prince pressed further, remarking that anyone accused of theft would say the same thing, since no one wanted to lose a hand over it. The Duke swore on his own life and his family's honor that he was telling the truth. The prince then turned his attention elsewhere, asking why the Duke's aide was bleeding. The Duke explained it was from a short while earlier, describing it only as a sudden accident. Tolan stayed silent, sweat on his brow, clearly holding back whatever he actually remembered. A tense shadow loomed as the scene flashed back to the chaos of the chase, sword drawn mid-motion against the dark shape that had been pursued through the trees. Back in the present, the aide hesitated before speaking up again, addressing the prince directly with growing suspicion in his voice. The prince cut him off sharply, declaring it unacceptable for someone of lesser status to interrupt a conversation between royals, calling him a poorly educated brat for the attempt. Turning back to the Duke, the prince suggested that if Tolan's outburst was due to his head injury still not healing, perhaps the Duke should lend him a sword so he could settle the matter himself. Tolan froze, gripped roughly by the hair, sweat pouring down his face as the threat hung in the air. Tolan's eye trembled as he tried to speak, addressing the prince but unable to finish his sentence, sweat and fear plain on his face. Duke Fetus cut in first, bowing before the prince, and admitting his aide had made a serious mistake. He offered to discipline Tolan harshly himself if the prince would show mercy, and the prince accepted, praising the Duke's loyalty as admirable. The scene shifted to Tolan lying beaten on stone flooring, motionless, while a voice above him remarked coldly that this was truly exemplary, calling him an imperial dog who would not even flinch while his own aide suffered near death. Duke Fetus knelt before that same figure, hearing the chilling promise that his son would also grow up to be a loyal dog, just like him. Back in the forest, the prince gripped the bag tightly, telling the Duke that meeting like this was fate, and that he would trust him with it for the day. His expression darkened as he warned that the item inside was extremely important, instructing the Duke that even in death, he must not let it leave his body. He pressed further, demanding to know if the Duke understood the weight of that order. The Duke lowered his head, swearing to humbly obey the prince's glorious command. With the exchange settled, the prince cheerfully excused himself, wishing the Duke a fun time hunting, relieved that his body suddenly felt lighter now that the burden was gone. Walking off alone, he privately admitted his performance had been terrible, but told himself he needed to plant at least that much of a seed, feeling sorry for Tolan all the same. Elsewhere, Tolan apologized to the Duke for causing him trouble, and the Duke brushed it off, telling him to be grateful his limbs were still intact before suggesting they head back to rest for the day. Tolan suddenly spoke up again, telling the Duke he had remembered something about the person who had thrown the stone at him. He revealed it had been the seventh prince. The Duke stopped him immediately, admitting he hadn't realized it himself until seeing the prince in person, and told Tolan firmly that nothing more needed to be said. A narrator's voice explained that in the original novel, Duke Fetus would eventually cause a devastating incident during next year's hunting competition, driven by the death of his son within that year. The prince, reflecting on this, admitted he needed a strong enough stimulus to force that same incident to occur during the current competition instead. Elsewhere, one of the golden-haired princes announced his wish to the emperor would be developing the land around the temple. His brother sneered instead, declaring he would clear out the vagrants he saw as parasites infesting the imperial capital. The narrator's voice returned, addressing Duke Fetus directly, stating that his future was already set. The Duke's fate was declared. He would rebel against the royal family because that was determined to be his destiny. A sudden light cuts across the darkening sky above the forest, streaking down into the trees as dusk settles over the land. Ran crouches low behind the bushes, glancing around cautiously, relieved that he checked the sky more than 10 times before coming down, confident there were no witnesses to see him land. Walking past a camp of tents, his thoughts turn bitter. He thinks about what he did to Fetus and Tolan, feeling as though the events twisted him into someone he never meant to be. He accepts it grimly, reminding himself of the villain role he now carries. His memory shifts back to right after a competition had ended, where he crosses paths with someone unexpected in the open field. A woman recognizes him, first greeting him warmly, and remarking how unusual it is to see him walking alone through the forest like this. He is caught off guard, realizing she is the first princess, someone he never expected to run into in a place like this. He offers her a proper greeting, but she brushes off the formality, reminding him they are siblings who share the same imperial blood, and don't need such stiffness between them. She asks him plainly where he left the horse he rode out on since he has returned without it. He fumbles for an answer, claiming he only wanted fresh air and left the horse back at the quarters. She tells him she doesn't understand his explanation. Her tone sharpens as she asks why he would lie to his own flesh and blood. Startled, he asks what she means by that. She explains that while strolling through the western forest that day, she came across a masterless black horse, an unfamiliar color, and when she asked her servant about it, she was told it belonged to him. Her expression darkens as she reveals she personally ordered that black horse killed, stating that livestock which fails to obey royalty deserves to die. Alarmed, he immediately kneels and apologizes, explaining that embarrassment over losing the horse made him twist the truth without thinking. She tells him to raise his head, saying his posture makes it look as though she is punishing her own brother. She adds that she is simply relieved he made it back safely on his own, offering him another horse anytime he needs one. Once she is gone, he reflects that the first princess is a difficult person to read, since it is nearly impossible to tell what she is really thinking. She, meanwhile, wonders privately why he left so quietly, questioning whether the ability she assumes he has simply doesn't work on her. Later, beneath a night sky near the tents, he starts to explain himself, insisting it wasn't what it seemed. The man across from him interrupts with his own theory instead, that he was chasing a beast, tripped over a rock, fell, and struck his head on another rock entirely. A duke sits with his aide, remarking that he has witnessed every kind of injury at the royal hunting competitions over the years, but never one caused by nothing more than a couple of rocks. The aide, bandaged and pale, listens as the duke asks how long recovery will take. The Duke warns that despite appearances, the injury is serious and demands at least a week of strict bed rest. The aide panics, protesting that a week means missing the entire competition, insisting his duty as an aide requires him to stay by the Duke's side no matter what. The Duke cuts him off gently, telling him recovery comes first and that he should rest until the closing ceremony. He assures the aide that he and Jack will manage the rest of the hunting competition without him. Reluctantly convinced, the aide agrees to do his absolute best to rest, promising to honor the Duke's wishes. Alone with the Duke afterward, the aide points out that in all his years of service, this is the first time he has ever been given a day off, joking that his real dream has always been to eat and play, if only he had the money for it. The Duke laughs, declaring he'll win the competition just for the sake of that dream, promising to reward him afterward with development rights to a gold mine. That night, a candle flickers on a wooden table as the aide sleeps restlessly, jolting awake with a gasp. His hand raised as if bracing against something unseen, Summonon speaks close to his ear, holding a small wrapped object near his face, as he cries out in shock. Elsewhere, someone reflects coldly, calling the aide's devotion truly exemplary, mocking him as an imperial dog who doesn't even flinch when facing mortal danger. In the darkness, a grieving man covers his face, weeping as he murmurs that his son will grow up to be a loyal dog as well, just like his father before him. The Duke lies awake at night, unable to sleep, deciding that maybe stepping outside for fresh air will help clear his mind. His expression tightens as memory pulls him elsewhere, toward a heavy stone-covered pack sitting beside a young boy standing in the dark. The pack rattles as father and son walk together through the night forest beneath a red moon, the father telling the boy there is something important he wants to show him at the temple. Inside the temple, the father recounts an old legend of a time long ago when the world was consumed by chaos and turmoil before a being of salvation descended from the heavens. The boy lights up, recognizing the story from a book, asking if his father is talking about the legendary figure known as Sierra the Great. Standing before a towering statue gripping a massive sword, the father explains that this god-like figure wielded mysterious power strong enough to subjugate those who endlessly waged war. He continues, revealing that this very figure united the empire over 1,000 years ago and named it Aberan, becoming the founder of the imperial family they now serve. Turning to his son with pride, the father calls him his treasure, addressing him warmly by name Flynn. He asks his son to follow in his footsteps one day, to grow into a proud sword serving the imperial family as sunlight breaks over the mountains behind him. The Duke walks on with the stone-filled pack still strapped to his back, wondering under his breath why he is still carrying such heavy weight. His face tightens as he questions himself further, wondering whether it is out of loyalty that he keeps carrying it, or something else entirely. A distant horn cuts through the sky, and he freezes, recognizing the sound, and asking aloud if this could really be what he thinks it is. Soldiers gather in shock, murmuring in disbelief that so many beasts were slain in a single night, questioning how one person could have accomplished all of it. A massive burst of energy tears through the battlefield, and onlookers realize the first prince has wiped out the beasts entirely, leaving them to wonder if the hunting competition has already been decided. Avois explains that the competition was originally meant to last 4 days, but the first prince of the Aberan Empire achieved an overwhelming hunting record in a single night alone. The golden-haired first prince is formally declared the winner of the hunting competition, his expression calm and composed under the open sky. The emperor congratulates him on his victory, and the prince responds with practiced gratitude, thanking his father for the honor. As tradition dictates, the emperor asks the first prince to state the wish he desires as his reward. The crowd murmurs anxiously, recalling how the fourth prince once used his own competition reward to request the right to purge nomads from the border regions. Wondering what this prince might ask for instead, the prince kneels formally before his father, stating that vagrants have recently been infesting the area around the temple of Sierra the Great, threatening its dignity and security. With a faint smile, he explains that in order to restore the temple's ruined aesthetics, he requires the emperor's authority. The scene shifts to a burning village, soldiers moving forward with weapons drawn as flames rise behind them. Blood drips down a soldier's face as he grits out the words, humbly requesting the authority to cleanse them completely. Through the haze, a child's silhouette stands amid the wreckage, faintly calling out for his father. The father's face turns rigid with alarm as the boy's voice reaches him clearly, calling out to him directly this time. His hands grip his weapon tightly as troubled thoughts surface, recognizing himself as a loyal imperial dog, yet hesitating over the fate of that particular child. He moves forward through the chaos of the burning village, his soldiers following close behind as the surroundings blur into motion. His expression hardens with regret, as he apologizes quietly to his son Flynn, weapon still raised in his grip. Time shifts again, and someone stirs weakly, murmuring broken words before finally managing a clear voice greeting the figure standing over them with a simple, tired address. "Hey you!" A soldier stumbles, trying to greet Rand properly and ends up sprawled on the ground mid-sentence. Rand tells him calmly to move slowly, warning that the blood rushing to his head will make him dizzy. Struggling to rise, the aide rattles off advice to himself between winces, muttering about antibiotics and olive leaves before catching himself and asking Rand what actually brings him here. Ron hesitates before answering directly, then presses the aide with his own question, asking if he even realizes what situation the Duke is currently in, since the closing ceremony should have already started. The tanked aide freezes, repeating the words back in disbelief, unable to process that the ceremony is already underway. A voice urges him to hurry, telling him he'd better run there immediately, and the aide takes off in a panic, stumbling past the crowd. He shoves through the gathered soldiers, apologizing repeatedly as he forces his way forward, shouting for everyone to let him through. Reaching the front, he gasps out a final apologetic "excuse me," breathless from the run. The scene shifts to the closing ceremony grounds, where knights raise their swords around a kneeling figure. A voice calls out uncertainly, recognizing the kneeling man as the Duke. Fetus looks on in stunned anger, demanding to know what is happening to Duke Fetus, unable to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. Kneeling before the Emperor, the Duke declares that his family has served Sierra the Great since the very beginning, protecting the imperial line from the closest vantage point for over 1,000 years. The first prince cuts in coldly, remarking that the Fetus family seems better suited for the lowly task of dealing with vagrants around the temple than for any higher purpose. The Duke, unshaken, repeats his formal request before the Emperor, identifying himself plainly as Agony Fetus. The Emperor responds, acknowledging the loyalty the Duke has devoted his entire life to and agrees to grant his request. But he adds, almost amused, that it is comical how such great loyalty could lead the Duke to stand against the will of royalty itself. Blue energy erupts violently as the first prince unleashes his power, mocking the idea that he would ever show mercy. Baring his teeth, he sneers at the Duke, calling him mad and asking if he has forgotten that his current actions warrant immediate execution. Closing his eyes calmly, amid the crackling energy, the Duke accepts his fate, stating that the sin of interrupting a sacred ceremony is one he will pay for with his own life. The aide's voice tears through the air in horror as he screams the Duke's name, finally arriving just in time to witness it all. Elsewhere, Rand watches quietly among the gathered crowd, thinking to himself that it is finally starting, wishing someone he once knew could be watching from a distance as well. Later, beside a winding river cutting through green hills, a hooded figure crouches alone at the water's edge, gripping a bottle loosely, lost in silence beneath the open sky. Water ripples faintly against the hooded figure crouched by the riverbank, a small sound stirring beneath the quiet, catching his attention. He lifts his head slightly beneath the hood, startled, asking aloud what this strange presence could be as glowing water twists around him. The current surges upward violently, swirling into the sky above the hills as a voice presses him, asking if he can clearly see the execution ceremony of Agony Fetus unfolding, and whether he recognizes the might of the royalty he will soon have to face. The hood falls back just enough to reveal sharp, focused eyes as the moment settles into place, the true protagonist of the novel Dark Header, known simply as Radel. The former Imperial Knight Commander stood before his men, sword raised high against a burning sky. He was the head of the Fetus family, a lineage that had guarded the royal bloodline for 1,000 years, and a soldier who had bled for the Empire across 30 years of war. Lightning coiled around his kneeling frame as chains of energy tore through the air. He was named the Sinner, now Agony Fetus, stripped of every title he had earned. Raja Aberon, the first prince of the Empire, stood over him with a hand crackling with power. He declared the sentence aloud and moved to carry out a summary execution on the spot. The blast tore through the battlefield, light and current, ripping across the ground. As the man's silhouette convulsed under the strike, the soldiers behind him stood frozen, faces pale, throats tight with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Consciousness slipped as the current dragged him under, his voice breaking apart mid-thought. Unable to draw a breath, something shifted. A different face surfaced within the same collapsing light, eyes snapping open to a scene that did not belong to him. A voice called out a name that was not his own, confused at finding him in this place. Another voice spoke of him faking dizziness earlier, relieved now to see him looking well. A wounded man among the group turned to another, admitting shame at parting in such a pitiful state, asking him to look after someone named Flynn. A third figure standing apart cut him off with a single word, The one who had interrupted studied him closely, recognizing the face in front of him as belonging to the seventh prince. Overwhelmed by the flood of unfamiliar memories and voices, he struggled to make sense of what was being said around him. Through gritted teeth, he forced out a denial, refusing the fate closing in on him, insisting he could not die yet. Raising a hand crackling with restrained current, the same commanding figure prepared to act again, expression unreadable. A column of light split the sky, striking down with tremendous force as the rocky terrain below shook. The shockwave rolled outward across the clouds before the light collapsed inward, leaving a battered figure broken on the ground. Another man watched from below, arm outstretched, golden hair catching the light as the aftermath settled around him. A young boy with round glasses was gripped by unfamiliar hands, his face caught between shock and desperate urgency. The dark-haired officer's expression remained hard and unreadable, his eyes fixed on something just beyond view. In a quiet library, a gray-haired boy sat hunched over a notebook, pen in hand, recording every detail as though his life depended on remembering it all correctly. In a quiet library, the boy at the desk paused his writing as a streak of light shot across the sky outside the arched window, catching his attention mid-sentence. The light climbed higher, a hooded figure below turning his head sharply to track it. As it tore through the clouds, he hit the ground hard, sprawled across wet grass, breath knocked out of him, only a quiet sound escaping his lips. An explosion tore through the earth where he landed, dirt and debris scattering outward before a second impact followed close behind. The blast rippled across the field as he pushed himself upright, staring ahead through the scattered wreckage. He studied the crater in front of him, uncertain what lay inside since the haze made it impossible to see clearly. The glow inside the wreckage pulsed, and he wondered aloud whether what sat within the light was actually a person. Something shot free of the wreckage, curving high into the sky, trailing a streak of golden light before an object launched from his hand and arced upward to intercept it. The figure spun through the air, struck mid-flight, tumbling down out of the sky toward the ground below. He landed hard again, the impact sending a shockwave through the grass, sprawled and unmoving for a moment after the fall. He climbed to his feet slowly, catching his breath, dragging himself upright as rain soaked through his cloak. Standing fully now, he flexed his hand and studied the wreckage behind him, breathing hard from the exertion. He wondered aloud whether he'd lost whatever he'd been chasing, staring up as another streak of light cut across the distant sky. Elsewhere, the boy in bandages and glasses stood among a group of soldiers, murmuring the word Duke under his breath. The soldiers spoke of the hero, Duke Fetus, meeting his end, and wondered what would happen to the Duke's family now, while someone noted that the bandaged boy standing before them was the Duke's aide. An elderly bearded man declared it over, and a blond man beside him acknowledged the order, adding that the closing ceremony of the royal hunting competition would be held at noon. A crowd gathered on the open field before a raised platform, waiting as an announcement called all participants to assemble. The blond man in white flexed his knuckles and remarked that they had caught one little bug. He walked past a line of bowed soldiers, remarking that mercy only invites those who forget their place to act up. Among the murmuring crowd, someone declared the Fetus family finished too, calling their former head a fool for ever leading it, while the bandaged aide stood silent, absorbing every word. Someone in the crowd jeered at the bandaged aide, calling him a traitor while others laughed, but he stayed silent, offering nothing back. A dark-haired officer among the mocking soldiers noted quietly that Tolan's heart must be breaking, since he had been close to the fallen duke as his aide. He walked alone toward a tent, refusing to let the taunts touch him. Inside, he knelt among broken furniture, gathering pieces off the floor in silence. Something caught his eye on the ground, a rolled scroll tied shut, and he wondered aloud if it was a letter. He turned it over and recognized the crest pressed into the wood, realizing it belonged to the Fetus family. The letter opened with a line warning that if it was ever read, the writer was likely no longer alive, and it asked whoever found it to pray he could reach a place called Tarum. In a memory, the Duke held the same scroll and asked whoever read it to look after his son, Flynn, calling it an old man's final request. The Duke, in another memory, admitted he had a feeling he would soon make a terrible mistake, and told his aide that if that moment came, there was one thing he needed to know. The letter insisted that whatever happened afterward was in no way the aide's fault. The declaration continued, naming Agony Fetus as head of the family, and stating his final wishes plainly. It appointed his aide, Tolan Krisa, as acting head of the Fetus family should anything happen to him, closing with a blessing for his protection. Elsewhere, in a grand tower, a voice remarked coldly that someone had used their manus quite extravagantly. The same voice added that if he believed himself fully cured, he was gravely mistaken, since his condition had only worsened since the royal hunting competition. A wounded blonde man on the floor gripped a glowing stone and demanded to know if the treatment method was flawed since it was supposed to absorb his corrupted manas. The dark-haired figure standing over him advised releasing the manas slowly, warning that forcing it out too quickly would only make things worse. The blonde man cursed under his breath, vowing that once his body recovered, he would tear his tormentor apart. The dark-haired man answered calmly, saying that was likely what he was thinking, and reminded him the disease could not be cured all at once, that he was alive at all, only because of the stone. He mentioned offhandedly that Talon was rumored to still be in a coma, admitting it stirred an odd sense of guilt in him. Meanwhile, the bandaged boy's eyes snapped open, wide, and staring as he stirred back to consciousness. Talon woke disoriented, unsure where he was, as he stared up at an unfamiliar ceiling. Butler rushed forward, calling him acting head and urging him to rest, but Talon brushed the help aside, insisting he was fine and asking to be let up. The butler warned that he had been unconscious for over 2 weeks and could collapse again at any moment. Ignoring the warning, Talon said he needed to see the young duke first and asked what state the family was currently in. The butler admitted honestly that the situation was bad, since every business partner had abandoned the family and the household staff had all left as well. He added that their finances were dire, but they had no standing left to ask the royal family for help, blaming it all on the recent incident. As they walked, the butler began to explain what had become of the young duke, and Talon cut in, asking after him by name. The young duke came into view, bandaged and startled, calling out to Talon the moment he saw him. A small boy in shorts asked if he was feeling all right, and Talon, kneeling, apologized for causing him concern, insisting he was fine. The boy noted that many problems had piled up while Talon was unconscious, including the fact that his father's funeral arrangements still hadn't been settled. Talon asked if that was true, and the boy confirmed it firmly, repeating that it was. Outside, 2 servants gossiped that the former duke's reckless act must have been because the young duke was baseborn, and wondered if they should flee before being branded traitors themselves. Talon listened from a window above, reflecting grimly that the stigma of being called traitors to the empire would be nearly impossible to erase back inside. A servant addressed him formally as acting head, and Talon, expression unreadable, simply said the word pale. He ordered that the tongues of those gossiping outside be cut out and brought to him, calling it punishment for spreading false rumors about the young duke. The servant stammered in shock, questioning the order aloud. Talon asked coldly if he needed to repeat himself. The servant lowered his head and agreed to obey the command. Talon then declared there would be no funeral held at all, startling the young duke, who called his name in confusion. He explained that the former duke could no longer be considered a member of the family, and asked the boy to understand, even as the child demanded to know why Talon would do such a thing, only for Talon to repeat that he was now acting head of the fetus family. Talon told the young duke plainly that until he grew old enough to take his rightful place as head of the family, the duty to protect it fell to him, vowing that from now on he would act for the honor and survival of the fetus name. He took off his cracked glasses, holding them up against the sunlit sky, saying only that he would use them. He finished the thought coldly, declaring he would use any means necessary to see it through. Inside a grand imperial chamber, a curse erupts. A cry of frustration rings out as a body is sent flying, crashing through a window in an explosion of light and debris. The destruction continues in a violent burst, shouts of rage repeating as the room is torn apart by an unstoppable force blasting through it. A tall, blonde-haired man stands alone in the wreckage, breathing hard, his back to the shattered window as rain pours outside. The room behind him lies in ruins. Elsewhere, a maid reacts in alarm outside a set of heavy doors, startled and confused about her situation, unsure why she has ended up stuck there. The blonde man, muscular and menacing, snarls a threat about tearing someone apart. His fist clenches hard enough to crack the surface beneath it. Then his expression shifts, recalling something he needs to handle the next day. He gives an order to spread word that he is heading into the imperial forest, but privately intends not to actually go there himself. A dark-haired young man questions why he'd be asked to do something so absurd, explaining he has his own reasons for being there. The dark-haired man refuses to simply go in himself, revealing his real motive. If the blonde man announces he is the one entering the forest, no one else will be allowed inside. The blonde man grows suspicious, demanding to know what scheme is being cooked up and what the other intends to do alone in there. The dark-haired man, smiling faintly, claims it is simply for treatment and tells the blonde man to wait quietly in the room. In the meantime, his hand crackling with strange energy, violence breaks out between them, the dark-haired man's hand gripping at the blonde man's collar as they clash in a burst of motion, one of them cursing the other as a bastard. The blonde man overpowers him with crackling force, mocking him for acting as though he has become someone important lately, claiming he could simply consult the Empire's scholars about such a minor treatment. Choking the other man, the blonde man warns that his patience is running out and threatens to end his life right there. Struggling for breath, the dark-haired man mocks the idea of consulting scholars, warning that if that is the plan, he'd better hurry. The blonde man's face is bloodied, his condition worsening. Someone notes that using Manus, again, must have shortened his lifespan further. He groans in pain. A spray of blood staining the floor tiles beneath him, struggling to stay upright. In pain, he is warned that if he stops the treatment now, he won't be able to move properly for a week. The dark-haired man leans in, grinning, asking if he isn't curious how the imperial family would react once word spreads that the Empire's first prince has collapsed. Kneeling and coughing blood onto the floor, the blonde man is asked whether the family would try to save him or respond in some other way entirely. Barely holding himself up, he is told plainly, if the treatment fails, someone else will take the throne as the next emperor. Furious and humiliated, he spits out a curse, calling the other man a worm. Bloodshot eyes glare from the darkness. A voice snarls that the man still doesn't understand, warning him to use his head if he doesn't want to die. The blonde man wipes blood from his mouth, eyes glowing faintly, admitting he tolerates the other man only because they share the same blood. Though his patience runs thin, he orders that no one be assigned to monitor him, boasting that vanishing without a trace is one of his specialties. The dark-haired man reappears at a doorway, telling him that since the treatment has failed every time, it might be time to give up, since repeating it only exhausts them both and delays things further. The blonde man demands to know his true goal, why he keeps doing this to him. The dark-haired man hesitates before answering. He finally admits his goal, if he had to name one, is simply survival. The scene shifts to an open sky above a forest, a hawk gliding through the wind carrying something in its talons. The hawk soars higher, cutting across the treetops toward the light. Feathers and motion blur fill the sky as the bird streaks through the clouds. Back on the ground, a boot presses into the grass. The dark-haired man notes with satisfaction that he has searched the forest 3 times and confirmed there isn't a single person around. Standing alone in the greenery, he explains that he cleared the entire forest out on purpose, even risking the first prince's anger, because today he plans to experiment with his ability. He watches a horse rear up nearby, realizing after his last experience that he may be able to transform into other kinds of animals, and that a wider variety could make his ability far more useful than he first assumed. Leaning against a tree, he reasons that to figure this out, he needs to understand his ability precisely, since he needs to know its limits before relying on it. He digs through his bag, thinking that the fastest thing to determine is the exact condition required to transform into any given animal. Recalling past events, he notes the simplest theory is contact, since both animals he is transformed into so far had prior physical contact with him. He picks up a stick, deciding the only way to test the hypothesis is to try it directly. He sets up a small trap, saying he'll catch a new animal to find out, starting with something small. He places bait taken from the Imperial kitchen, reasoning that even a crude trap should work fine as long as it has good bait, just as something rustles nearby. Small creature stirs in the branches above. He looks up, spotting only a squirrel scurrying near the trap. The squirrel watches him warily, still cautious since the trap sitting nearby isn't even finished yet, silently wondering if it can be caught. Curious rather than afraid, the squirrel approaches on its own, drawn toward an offered acorn cupped in his hand. He scoops the squirrel up, lightly scolding it for being careless enough to approach a stranger so easily, warning it about what could happen if a bad person caught it like that. Setting it down, he notes to himself that he has succeeded in making contact and turns his attention to what comes next. He reaches down toward the small creature, resolving to give the transformation a try. Light bursts around him as he calls out the change, his body glowing as the transformation takes hold. A silent beat passes as he stands there afterward, seemingly unchanged, the transformation apparently not taking effect this time. He reconsiders, wondering if the situation itself matters when transforming, recalling that his past successful transformations happened in moments of desperation, when he badly wanted to fly or badly wanted to run. He tries to think like a squirrel would, wondering what such an action might be, whether it is wanting to climb a tree or dive into a burrow, questioning whether the desire has to be genuine from the very start. Without warning, he snatches the entire bag of acorns and takes off running on all fours. Now transformed, chittering rapidly as he flees. Startled, he shouts after his own transformed self, demanding to know why he is making off with the whole bag instead of just a few nuts. Sprawled on the ground where he fell back to human form, he insists that if the squirrel wanted acorns, it should have just asked instead of stealing the entire bag. Determined to test it again, he takes a good grip and readies himself for another attempt. He transforms once more, this time yanked upward by his own bag strap into the tree branches, chittering in surprise at how well the small body holds under the strain. Still human-shaped from the shoulders down, he grits his teeth midway through the shift, declaring he'll see who wins this tug of war between the two forms. The strap finally snaps, sending the fragments of wood flying as he grimaces, forced back into his human form by the impact. High above, a flock of birds scatters through the sky over the forest as the noise of the struggle carries upward. Night falls over the palace, its domes lit dimly under passing clouds. Back in his room, a maid knocks nervously and announces that dinner is ready, hoping there won't be any trouble this time as she waits for him to answer. He appears composed, but visibly dirtied from the day's experiments. His clothes stained, telling her not to be alarmed since he merely got dirty walking near the palace grounds. He answers the maid, admitting quietly to himself that he nearly got caught mid-transformation as a crow while she served his food. Alone, he reflects bitterly that in the end, he never figured out how to transform into anything new, having spent the whole day just chasing that squirrel around. He tells the maid his clothes are dirty and to fetch him new ones, adding that he should bathe before eating. She agrees, though hesitates, saying there is a problem. He presses her, asking what the issue is. She points out the bag he is carrying, asking nervously whether he brought the thing inside it with him, revealing the squirrel peeking out. He glances down, startled to realize the squirrel is still with him. He recoils, cursing the crazy squirrel as it wriggles and claws its way out of his grip. He lunges after it as it darts free, chasing it across the floor. The maid panics internally, wondering in horror whether the prince intends to torment the poor animal while he holds it up with a menacing grin. She frantically requests permission to throw the squirrel outside, begging him to spare its life. He warns her sharply that if she doesn't do as told, cute Dorami will suffer the consequences, having apparently named the creature. Confused but startled by his command, she reluctantly agrees to fetch the clothes he asked for. He snaps at her again, reminding her he already gave the order once, demanding she bring him new clothes immediately. She scrambles off through the halls, resolving urgently that she must hurry back, clutching fresh clothes. She rushes forward, silently panicking about cute Dorami. Repeating the squirrel's name to herself, she tells herself to just wait a little longer as she runs, folded clothes in hand. Unaware of a large shadow forming ahead, she stops short, coming face to face with a striking blonde woman in an elegant white gown, and gasps in recognition of the first princess. The princess, coldly composed, addresses her as Ran's servant and asks where she is headed in such a rush. Startled, the maid drops to the floor and begs forgiveness, spilling the folded clothes she was carrying as the princess questions what they are. Suspecting she may be secretly stealing imperial property, the maid swears desperately by Sierra the Great that the accusation isn't true, explaining that the seventh prince simply got his clothes dirty while walking in the garden. The princess remains unmoved, stating coldly that whether the excuse is true or false makes no difference to her, since deceiving her is impossible. Anyway, she quietly wonders to herself whether the maid's story holds any truth, or if it is merely a desperate excuse to save her own life before reaching a glowing hand toward her. Peering closer, the first princess pauses mid-thought, her eyes narrowing as something about the maid's appearance catches her attention, something unexpected surfacing in her mind. Elsewhere, in a darker setting, the dark-haired man stands watching silently, his expression unreadable. Back with the princess, she muses aloud that her brother clearly wasn't in the garden after all, since the maid's story doesn't add up, quietly noting instead that he actually had business in the imperial forest. Night settles over the palace as a voice presses him with a question. Will he keep running from what is coming, or finally face it? Inside the residence, the young man turns to an unexpected intruder, telling it plainly that this place isn't meant for creatures like it, and that he has no plans to let it stay. He identifies his target, a squirrel pressed against the wall. He offers to carry it back to the forest himself, asking it to just let itself be caught without a fight. The squirrel braces itself, squeaking rapidly, clearly refusing to go along quietly. He studies the creature, troubled by how a rodent could make it this deep into the palace without anyone noticing. His mind drifts back to his old life, to sleepless nights in a cramped basement apartment, rats scratching behind the walls. The memory breaks as the squirrel sinks its teeth into his hand, and he snaps, demanding to know what kind of trouble it thinks it is starting. He finally gets a grip on it, telling it to behave and climb into the bag. The squirrel bites down again, refusing to surrender. He recoils, calling it a brat, furious that something so small would dare bite the hand of royalty. The squirrel breaks free, scrambling madly across the floor to escape. It is already partway up the wall by the time he looks over, and he admits, almost impressed, that it climbed higher than he expected. He holds back from chasing it further, reasoning that pursuit will only send it fleeing somewhere new. He shuts his eyes, half serious, thinking it might be easier if he could just turn into a squirrel himself. Something shifts behind his eyes, a flicker of sudden realization. His silhouette rises in the dark, light sparking around him, as he asks if this strange feeling means what he suspects. The squirrel stares back, stunned, echoing the same disbelief. He confirms it to himself. He has finally worked out the condition needed to transform into a specific animal. A slow breath escapes him, followed by a satisfied smirk. The moment breaks as he plummets down a shaft, the squirrel below crying out, demanding to know why he is suddenly falling now. A dark shape crashes down through the residence, and a stunned voice gasps out that it is the princess, shocked that anything, even a squirrel, could survive a fall from that height. The first princess storms down the hallway, snapping at a terrified maid that she shouldn't have to tiptoe around her little brother's room, demanding to know if she is expected to ask permission just to enter. She grumbles to herself about how unlikable the servants here are, clearly irritated by the whole household. She stops short, spotting something small and dark crouched on the floor ahead, and asks what it is. The shape resolves into the squirrel, sprawled and twitching. She stares down at it, confused, asking if it is really a squirrel. She presses a hand to her mouth, unsettled by the idea that a wild animal is loose inside a royal residence, even if the boy living there has been neglected by the imperial family. Nearby, the maid claps her hands over her face, overwhelmed, squealing about double the cuteness. The squirrel's face twitches with visible stress, and it mutters to itself that this whole situation is driving it crazy. The next day dawns over the palace towers, calm and clear. The squirrel curls up against a hand, stroking it gently, and the prince remarks, half amused, wondering at the sight of himself acting this way. He sits back, watching the squirrel resting on the table, noting it hasn't left his side since the previous night, and wondering aloud if it is doing this because it knows he saved it. He tells it plainly that hauling it back to the forest is too much of a hassle, so it'll need to make sure it stays hidden on its own from now on. He reflects with a smirk that he has finally cracked how the transformation power works, surprised at how ridiculous the actual condition turned out to be. He recalls the first creature he ever turned into, a crow wing spread wide against a stormy purple sky. Later came the black horse, and eventually the squirrel, all of them tied together by one shared requirement before the change could happen. He realizes it wasn't just any contact, he had to touch precisely at the nape, an oddly specific rule for a power this unpredictable. Setting that aside, he decides the real problem now is the first princess. Mental aberration, he admits the novel's description never prepared him for how genuinely frightening her expression would be in person. Thankfully, a maid named Anna covers for him, claiming the squirrel is his pet, buying him just enough time to slip out the window unnoticed. He returns to his human form and steps back into the room, thinking everything was about to end smoothly, only for the princess and the maid to freeze at the sight of him. Mental comments dryly on his unusual taste in keeping wild beasts inside the palace, then rises to leave for the night, saying it is already late. He answers politely, telling her yes, and asking her to come again next time, when she cuts him off before he finishes, telling him to come find her where she is staying, and the word tomorrow hangs heavy as he grimaces at the demand. She adds that there are matters they need to discuss. Back alone, he wonders to himself whether Mentil somehow figured it out, while the squirrel munches away obliviously at his feet. He can't guess what she could possibly want to talk about. He questions whether she has discovered his true identity, then quickly dismisses the thought, telling himself there is no way. Resigned, he throws his arms up, muttering that he has no choice but to go, since refusing isn't an option, and turns to ask the squirrel if he is right. A guard in full armor greets him formally at the entrance, welcoming the seventh prince. He is led before towering doors, remembering that the descriptions called her chambers grand, though he hadn't expected doors quite this massive, while a guard tells him the first princess is waiting inside. Seated regally by the fireplace, Mental greets him, remarking that he must have had a long journey to get there. She invites him to sit, saying his legs must be tired, but he declines, insisting the trip wasn't far and asking directly what she wanted to discuss. She cuts in sharply, asking if he didn't hear her tell him to sit. He falls silent for a moment, then apologizes for his rudeness. She waves it off with a light laugh, teasing that his curiosity must have gotten the better of him, adding that he was always the impatient type alone with her thoughts. She wonders when this child became someone so different, recalling that he ventured alone into the Imperial Forest, a place he'd never once visited before. He admits to himself this is exactly why he didn't want to face her. Explanation unfolds. Man's powers always manifest as abilities tied to nature. The Emperor commanding fire, the first prince commanding water. Mental's own ability, in a sense, stands above all the others. Her manus is called human, the power to read and manipulate people's minds. She tells him gently that she hopes he'll be honest with her, since it makes her deeply sad when her own family tries to deceive her. He steadies himself internally, repeating to stay calm, holding on to the one certainty he has. Mental's ability doesn't work on him. He reasons through it privately, thinking that if her ability had actually worked on him, she would have simply used it to force the answers she wanted out of him already. She must have only just realized her power doesn't take effect on him. He recalls what the novel revealed, that there are two conditions under which her ability fails to activate. First, the target has to be blood, related to Mental. Second, the target must genuinely love Mental as family. And that second condition is the real issue, since feeling familial love for her seems impossible in his case. He insists to himself there is absolutely no way he could ever feel that for this woman, while she presses him again, impatient, demanding he hurry and answer her. He is left staring out over the palace grounds, baffled, unable to understand why her ability isn't working on him if neither condition applies. The scene shifts entirely to a cave near a rushing waterfall, water echoing through the stone. Deep inside, a drop of light falls through the dark toward a figure lying motionless on the ground. An old battle-worn man stirs, groaning in pain as he slowly regains consciousness. He forces himself upright, disoriented, asking aloud whether this place is Terrarum, or maybe Hody. A hooded figure seated nearby tells him simply that he survived. Startled, the old man demands to know who this stranger is and where he has ended up, stunned to find himself still alive. The hooded figure explains that he hadn't opened his eyes for so long. They assumed he was dead. The stranger grips the hilt of a gleaming sword, announcing that he will now begin asking his questions. Sword drawn and aimed, the hooded figure asks whether the old man is loyal to the Aberan Empire. The old man, alarmed, demands to know what this is about. The hooded man presses further, telling him it is a simple yes or no, and that his answer alone will decide how he chooses to proceed. A blonde woman raises her hand toward the seventh prince, her mind-reading ability activating with a surge of light. Nothing happens. She realizes it isn't working on him at all. He stares back, quietly asking himself why. She presses him for an answer, demanding to know why he suddenly feels like a different person than the boy she once knew. Kneeling beside him, she turns the puzzle over in her head. If her power has failed, there must be a reason. She begins to suspect it has something to do with someone new occupying this body. The prince recalls his own situation. In the original novel, the seventh prince was such a minor character that almost nothing was written about him. He is working with almost no information to survive on. She leans closer, telling him she can practically hear him calculating his next move, mocking how difficult it must be for him to respond. He wonders if he should keep playing dumb, but questions whether she will actually let the matter drop that easily. He tries to imagine how the real seventh prince would react in this exact moment, forcing himself to mirror that person as her power reaches toward him again. Getting no response, she decides she'll need another method. She rises and calls out. She claps her hands and orders the Imperial Knights to enter. Two knights step in and ask if she summoned them. She complains that her own dear younger brother refuses to speak. She casually instructs the knights to force him to talk by slitting open the mouth of a servant named Ran Aberan. The knights freeze in shock, stunned that the seventh prince himself is standing there, witnessing the order. The prince's expression hardens as he thinks that lowly servants like them could never be blamed for something this terrible, refusing to let an innocent person take the fall in his place. The knights protest, begging her to reconsider such a command, but she only remarks that they're making far too much noise. She declares flatly that she despises noise, and the knights brace themselves, weapons raised, ready to carry out her will regardless of the cost. Steel flashes. A blade swings down. One knight demands to know what the prince means to do, as he moves to intervene and stop the violence before it starts. He tells himself it can't be helped since he won't get an answer, standing firm as sweat beads on his brow, having just put himself between the blade and the servant. She warns him to choose his next words carefully, telling him there is only one way out of this situation for him now. He suddenly changes tactics entirely, crying out that his mother has passed away, feigning grief to throw her off balance. She pauses, caught off guard, asking what exactly he is talking about. Recovering her composure, she narrows her eyes and asks what makes him say that, then presses further, demanding to know if he has secretly been in contact with his mother all this time. He backpedals immediately, insisting that is not what he meant, stumbling to explain himself before she can draw the wrong conclusion. He describes the necklace his mother left behind before she vanished, a piece with a blue gemstone glowing at its center. She told him that as long as the light inside it never faded, the two of them would find their way back to each other someday. But recently, that blue light had begun to dim on its own. Then, without warning, the gemstone turned black and shattered completely. After a moment of panic, an idea takes shape in his mind. He claims the thought that came to him was that his mother, who had spent her whole life longing for something, had finally been laid to rest in her homeland in the East. She stares back at him unmoved, calling it a blatant lie from beginning to end. He continues building the story anyway, explaining that among all the mistresses who bore the emperor's children, his mother was the only one who ever managed to escape the imperial family. The true reason for her escape was never recorded. It was only ever assumed that she had fled back to her hometown in the East. Some believed her departure had to do with the fact that she gave birth to a black-haired prince, an unwanted omen inside the palace. Regardless of the reason, she never resurfaced in the novel's story until its very final pages. The woman questions him further, recalling that he once resented his birth mother deeply. He admits he isn't sure anymore, saying that as a child he only resented her for leaving him behind. He adds that maybe the real reason he always found himself staring toward the eastern sky and pulling the necklace out every night was something else entirely. He confesses it might have simply been because he missed her, letting the necklace dangle from his fingers as he speaks. She asks whether that revelation changed how he feels about the family he has left, watching the broken pendant swing from his hand. She remarks that it is fascinating how a lifetime of resentment could shift into longing in a single instant. He replies that perhaps that is simply what family is, letting the necklace fall from his fingers onto the table. She studies him in silence, saying nothing back. Turning to the knights outside, she orders them to sheathe their swords and wait outside the room. Instead, they accept the command without hesitation. She tells him that everything that happened inside this room will be wiped from his memory entirely, her eyes glowing as she prepares to use her power. The door creaks open on its own as she moves toward him. She pulls him into an embrace, remarking that he must have suffered so much emotionally through everything he described. He allows a small breath of relief, thinking to himself that the plan actually worked. She holds him close and adds that, even if he is a black-haired failure, he is still her younger brother. He can only wonder to himself whether she is actually messing with him. He reflects on her ability to control any human at will, and reasons it makes sense she'd grow suspicious the moment such an absolute power failed on him. He also notes that he was never aligned with the first princess's faction to begin with, so her guard drops. The scene shifts back to the necklace, now revealed as nothing more than a cheap trinket he'd picked up somewhere. His lie had worked, and he was safe for now. His thoughts drift elsewhere, wondering what became of Duke Fetus, a man who in the original novel falls into a valley and loses both legs, and questioning whether that man ever crossed paths with the story's true protagonist. A waterfall crashes down a cliffside in the wilderness, as he wonders whether the Duke actually died from the fall. Deep in a cavern, an old man groans in pain, warning someone nearby not to make any reckless moves. A hooded figure stands over him with a sword raised, calmly informing him that his right leg is broken. The old man realizes he is unarmed and injured, with no way to fight back in his current condition. The hooded stranger's stance is flawless, his blade impossibly sharp. Even in the darkness, it is clear this is no ordinary swordsman. The old man panics, begging the stranger to lower the sword and demanding to know what is happening. The hooded man speaks calmly, remarking that his target must not have been awake very long. He explains that a few days earlier he had spotted a sphere of water crossing the sky, but when he tried to chase it down, it moved too fast and he lost track of it. He adds that from what he could tell, someone had likely been trapped inside that sphere, and assumed they'd been destroyed on impact given the speed of the crash. The old man's eyes widen as he realizes the stranger is talking about him, the very sphere that carried him away from the first prince's execution. He can't understand how he is still alive. Piecing it together, he wonders if the sword wielder is searching for that same stone container. He pats himself down and admits the item isn't on him anymore. guessing it must have slipped away during the chaos of the execution. The hooded man continues his story, revealing that by chance he stumbled upon an old man collapsed and covered in blood inside a nearby cave. The sword swings down toward the old man's head as the tension breaks. The stranger presses the blade to his throat and demands in the name of God Amika whether he remains loyal to the Aberrant Empire. The old man stammers out the god's name in shock, suddenly recognizing who stands before him. Realizing exactly what kind of person he has run into, the old man cries out in despair that of all people to encounter in this situation, it had to be a heretic. The scene shifts to a grayscale flashback. A voice observes that the figures lying scattered across the rocky ground looked like local drifters, remarking that such a sight was common in this part of the world. A young boy stands crying with blood on his cheek as a cold voice mocks the man beside him for showing no reaction while his own aide is dying, calling him a model imperial dog and predicting the boy will grow into the same kind of loyal hound. An older man warmly greets the same boy, calling him his son, Flynn, and the greatest treasure he has ever had. Before a towering statue of a robed figure holding a massive sword, the father instructs his son to follow in his footsteps and become the sword of the imperial family, tasked with eliminating every heretic who threatens the empire. Returning to the present, the old man regains his composure and insists he knows nothing about loyalty to the Aberrant Empire, claiming he merely wandered there by accident and is nothing more than a senile old man trying to avoid the hooded swordsman's blade. An old knight limped through the dark on a rope leash, led deeper into a cave. He thanked his captor for treating his wounded leg, then admitted he no longer cared where he was being taken. The hooded captor kept walking in silence. The old knight asked him to loosen the rope around his left ankle, saying it was hard to walk with it dragging. The hooded man answered with one word, "No." The old knight pushed his case, warning that a fall at his age could be disastrous, and he might not get back up. He added that, if that happened, it would only be more trouble for his captor to drag him along. The hooded man said nothing, his eyes sharp beneath the hood. He kept walking, pulling the rope taut behind him, unmoved by the warning. The old knight stumbled again, gritting his teeth. He muttered to himself that he was being completely ignored. The hooded man's thoughts turned to the cave itself. He found it strange that a place like this existed near the imperial forest, and he recalled the old man mentioning a name earlier, Amika. He remembered that Amika was the name of a group of heretics believed wiped out 50 years ago. He wondered if they had actually been hiding in this cave the entire time. The old knight's mind drifted back to before he lost consciousness. He recalled being launched toward the forest's central tower, though he wasn't sure if it was the western or southwestern side. He told himself that once he escaped, he would be able to pinpoint the cave's location. For now, his priority was memorizing the layout so he could return later with reinforcements. The hooded man overheard this thinking and responded coldly, calling it absurd that a traitor to the imperial family still thought like the imperial knight commander. The hooded man suddenly stopped and asked for the old knight's name. The old man hesitated before starting to answer. He introduced himself as Agony Fetus. Reaching further into the cave, the hooded man touched the wall and said he'd been honestly surprised when he first found the old man, adding that this cave was protected by a divine blessing. He explained that it wasn't a place anyone could enter by their own will, especially not someone from the Aberrant Empire. A blade struck down into the ground, and light burst upward in the shape of a glowing circle carved with symbols. Fetus was thrown back by the force, shielding his face and demanding to know what was about to happen. The cave ceiling tore open, revealing the imperial capital beyond in the light of dawn. A voice called out his name. The voice declared there were only two possible reasons Fetus could be standing there: sent by the Aberrant Empire to wipe them out, or summoned by the calling of the god Amika. The hooded man lowered his hood, revealing his face, and said that either way, Fetus was welcome to Amika's domain. Elsewhere, under a moonlit tower window, a blond young man jolted awake with a strained groan, blue markings glowing across his arms as he clenched his fists. A young man reclined on a couch, thinking that since the timeline had accelerated, it was better for Fetus and the protagonist to start moving sooner. He closed his eyes, hoping to get news about the protagonist soon, admitting he felt a bit guilty for making the old Duke Fetus suffer needlessly. A blond man burst in furious, slamming his fist onto the table and cracking it, demanding to know why so little had been brought today, insisting more was needed for him to recover faster. The dark-haired man looked up at him, stunned, asking if he had really just been yelled at. The blond man turned away, brushing it off as frustration, then asked how much longer he had to keep enduring this treatment. The dark-haired man sprawled on the couch, reminded him that rushing the process would ruin his body and that he needed patience. He then asked if there was anything more dangerous than the hookah. The blonde man kept smoking, prompting confused pushback. The blonde man snapped back, reminding him he'd once said that if he was really worried, he should quit the hookah first. The dark-haired man smiled sweetly and agreed that since it was bad for his health anyway, quitting would be a good idea, earning a furious "you bastard" in response. The blonde man stormed off cursing, while the dark-haired man noted privately that the hookah really was ruining his body. He observed that everything the blonde man consumed, the wine, the dinner, was practically poison to his system. He reflected that Regression was destined to depend on this treatment until the day he died, unless the seed planted in his body was dealt with. Later, the dark-haired man announced they should wrap up the treatment, reminding everyone they couldn't be late for the evening ritual. Blue light surged through a grand hall as a figure reached down, channeling glowing energy from his palm into the floor below. A white-haired man absorbed the surge with visible strain, while two others behind him praised him, remarking his mana had increased more than usual and calling him amazing. An elder with long white hair and a heavy beard declared that if no more challengers stepped forward, today's ritual would conclude. The gathered royals began to disperse, each heading off in different directions. Zone dark-haired royal lingered behind, thinking to himself that he'd wait until everyone left so he could slip out last without drawing the attention of the other royals. A pink-haired man appeared, mockingly calling him Blackbug and asking why he was still sitting there since the ritual was already over. He teased further, asking if he was thinking about the birth mother who'd run away when he was little, then muttered to himself that he'd have to do something about this ill-mannered brat eventually. The first princess remarked to a pink-haired prince that he'd looked gloomy throughout the ritual, resting a hand on his head while a dark-haired prince knelt nearby. The pink-haired prince stammered a denial to the princess, insisting he definitely hadn't been sulking, while the dark-haired one simply greeted her with a formal bow. The princess asked the dark-haired prince if he was feeling unwell. He answered casually that he wasn't, adding that the ritual was usually a bit boring anyway. She replied that was a relief, noting that even if the ritual wasn't entertaining, it still held great significance, and advised him not to make his boredom so obvious. She turned to leave, saying she'd see them next time. The pink-haired prince stood frozen in stunned silence as she walked off. He grabbed the dark-haired prince by the collar, demanding to know why the first princess would ask about someone like him and what exactly was going on. He shook him harder, repeating the question. A white-haired prince interjected, asking if there was some kind of problem with Ran the pink-haired prince, startled, realizing his highness had noticed. The white-haired prince brushed it off, casually saying it was nothing, just an exchange of pleasantries with his younger brother. He commented that the dark-haired prince must be busy as well. As the group continued walking through the palace hall, he said his farewells, and the two princes exchanged a lingering glance as they parted ways. Two blonde figures descended a staircase together, one urging the other to go together. Brother, the dark-haired prince noted internally that this was the second prince, Dido Aberan, always found by the first prince's side, as the golden-haired prince called out to talk to him. In a torch-lit corridor, the blonde prince asked if he knew about the acting head who succeeded the late Duke Fetus, naming him as Talon Krisa. A bespectacled attendant observed that this prince seemed to be plotting something interesting regarding the central territory traded away for Duke Fetus's life. The blonde prince scoffed, declaring he had no interest in bugs like the Fetus family. He added that the Fetus family only had 1 year left anyway, since the land would fall back into his hands after that time passed. A voice cut in, saying there was no need to wait a whole year. The prince's eyes widened in surprise. The voice continued, offering a good idea and asking if he wanted to hear it. A fist slammed forward with tremendous force, cracking the air itself on impact. A blonde prince grabs Ran Aberan by the collar in a dim hallway, demanding to know what he really is. Ran stays calm and states his name and title. The seventh prince, Ran Aberan. The prince presses further, asking why both the first princess and first prince have started paying attention to someone like him. He threatens to burn him to ashes, raising a hand toward Ran. Flame gathers at his fingertips, but his voice already carries doubt as he asks what that attention would even mean for Ran. Ran stays unshaken, mocking the weak fire, saying it can barely light an oil lamp, let alone burn anyone. The prince's composure breaks, sweat runs down his face as he asks what would happen if others found out, admitting it wouldn't look good for him. Ran grabs his arm. The prince flinches, demanding to know how Ran figured him out. Ran sets his first condition for silence. The prince must drop his disrespectful tone and speak properly to his older brother. In a dim torture chamber, a captive man lies restrained on a blood-stained wooden table, his mouth pried open by metal restraints. His muffled cries fill the room as the interrogation drags on without mercy. His shadow stretches across the brick wall, distorted by firelight, as the torment continues in silence, broken only by his strained breathing. Elsewhere, a framed portrait hangs undisturbed, an aging gray-haired nobleman in formal military dress, his expression stern and composed. A blade suddenly tears through the canvas, slashing the image apart in one violent stroke. The destruction does not stop there. Books, armor, and personal belongings are hurled onto a growing pile of rubble. A voice declares that the man once known as Agony Fetus is to be treated from this point on as someone who never existed. A lit torch is lowered toward the wreckage. There will be no funeral, no grave, no monument left behind to mark that he ever lived, only the chance that he might still be remembered by those who choose to. The pile is set ablaze before a gathered crowd. An official standing apart from them warns that anyone caught honoring the man's memory will be punished severely. Later, at the doors of an estate, a fist knocks urgently. A voice calls out that a report is ready for the acting head. The one delivering it is Jack, commander of the Fetus Knights, an aging, hardened soldier with graying hair and a weathered face. Jack reports that, as ordered, his men apprehended those spreading false rumors within the Second Night Order. The offenders were held accountable, their wrists cut off, and they were expelled from service. Exhausted, he wipes a hand down his face, visibly worn from the effort. The acting head remarks that he looks quite tired. Jack apologizes, explaining that the household is so short-staffed that he has been working through the night himself. The acting head, a young man with blue hair and round glasses, acknowledges the effort briefly without looking up from his papers. Jack sets down a scroll, the list of deserters that had been requested. He explains that security has been tightened to stop further desertions, but nearly half of their manpower has already fled. The acting head studies the report in silence, noting privately that even the families who once served the Fetus household have severed their ties. If discipline among the remaining staff collapses as well, the family will be finished. Jack hesitates, voicing a concern of his own, wondering aloud whether erasing every trace of Duke Fetus might be going too far, and whether it risks provoking those knights who remain loyal to the former Duke. The acting head responds coldly, asking whether Jack still believes Agony Fetus holds any claim to being head of the family. Caught off guard, Jack immediately apologizes, admitting that he too once struggled to accept what the Duke had become. His thoughts drift back to the man's downfall, disbelief that someone once so honorable could meet such a disgraceful end, and confusion over how someone so loyal could have done what he did. Jack's expression hardens as he studies the acting head, feeling as though he is standing before an entirely different person than the one he once knew. Watching him, the acting head silently wonders just how much the old knight has changed, and whether it comes from the sting of feeling betrayed by the Duke he once served without question. A hand presses flat against a desk covered in handwritten pages. A voice announces that it is time, and that they should be on their way. Jack and the acting head walk together across a stone courtyard, flanked by two guards marching ahead of them. Their footsteps echo in unison as they head toward the estate's main gathering point. Outside, near a staircase, an aide informs the acting head that preparations for the speech are complete. The acting head simply responds that he understands. His footsteps continue down the stone steps, each one measured and deliberate, until his shoes finally meet solid ground. He arrives before the grand estate, standing alongside Jack and the aide as a crowd of servants and staff gather below, their backs turned toward the camera, waiting. Among the assembled staff, murmurs spread. Some wonder aloud what he intends to say after calling everyone together, while others whisper that kitchen workers were caught speaking carelessly the day before and had their tongues cut out as punishment. They question how anyone is expected to live under such conditions. Further back, hooded guards mutter among themselves, guessing that the harsh punishments stem from fear of the house being branded a family of traitors. One wonders whether they should flee before it becomes too late. Nearby, the bespectacled aide overhears the same anxious talk, worrying quietly about what might happen if someone were caught trying to escape in secret. He exhales, visibly relieved that no one has noticed his unease. Standing atop the platform, the acting head addresses the gathered crowd, declaring that House Fetus has served Sierra the Great since its founding. He continues, explaining that for over 1,000 years, the house has stood beside the imperial family as its closest guardian. However, he admits that the situation has grown chaotic recently, and that everyone present already understands the cause behind it. He speaks the name aloud. Agony Fetus, a traitor who betrayed the imperial family. Jack and the aide beside him react with visible shock at hearing the name spoken so plainly in public. The acting head continues, stating that Agony Fetus betrayed the empire and was executed by the imperial family, and that this single fact has shaken the wealth, unity, and honor the house built over 1,000 years down to its very roots. Looking out over the crowd, he acknowledges that even among those gathered now, many doubt the loyalty of House Fetus. Because of this, he offers them one last chance. Anyone who wishes to leave is free to do so today. He adds that even those whose contracts still have years remaining will be released without penalty if they choose to go. But he warns them to remember one thing as he begins to speak the house's name once more. From below, a young servant looks up at him standing on the balcony, calling out that House Fetus still has someone who will uphold its 1,000-year oath. The boy continues, declaring that as acting head of House Fetus, until young Lord Flynn Fetus succeeds as Duke, he will continue proving their loyalty to the Empire and the Imperial family, and that anyone who abandons loyalty to this house will face consequence. As a white banner bearing the Fetus emblem snaps in the wind above them, the acting head continues addressing the crowd, declaring that anyone who abandons loyalty to the house will receive no mercy whatsoever, and warns them to keep that in mind. The gathered staff watch him with tense, uneasy expressions. Off to the side, Jack reacts with alarm at the sharpness of the warning, privately admitting that his tone sounds somewhat threatening, but conceding that Lord Tolan is right to speak that way. The young servant continues his own speech below, insisting that House Fetus still has a legitimate heir, which means there remain countless opportunities to prove their loyalty to His Majesty. The acting head watches from a distance, reflecting that the more firmly the boy steadies the house, the sooner House Fetus will regain its footing. Later indoors, a maid teases him as he stumbles back in surprise, admitting to herself that the only thing she'll miss is seeing Lord Tolan flustered whenever the servants tease him. Jack praises the acting head for doing well, then asks whether the temple responded to their request for an audience. The young man explains that after that incident, the temple stated they will no longer receive anyone from House Fetus. He admits he expected as much, adjusting his tie as he considers the next move. He instructs that a certain item be sent along with their next request, telling them to inform the temple that they will not regret reading it. Alone with his thoughts, he addresses the late Duke directly in his mind, calling him Duke, and admitting he still does not know what his true intentions were. His thoughts continue as a convoy of carriages rolls along a countryside road, wondering whether the vagrants living in the slums around the temple were truly worth that much to the Duke. Riding within one of the carriages, he reflects that, though he'll never know the Duke's true intentions. Now, there is only one thought remaining in his mind. He resolves that the Duke's death will not be allowed to mean nothing. He will not let it be in vain. As the carriage wheels roll across the dirt road, he silently asks the Duke to watch over the land entrusted to him, and to witness what he intends to make of it, asking him to watch over him from wherever he now rests. The carriage comes to a stop, and a voice questions whether this is finally the place. Stepping out, he takes in the sight of the towering temple before him, remarking that it is magnificent. Standing before the grand structure, he acknowledges that although he has only been given a single year, a massive crowd stretches out before the city, gathered and waiting. Adjusting his glasses with quiet resolve, he vows that even if it costs him everything he has, he will never allow events to unfold the way the first prince intends. Elsewhere, two golden-haired imperial figures look down at the assembled crowd from a balcony. One remarks that the people have gathered in disgusting numbers, while the other suggests many are simply curious, since this will be the first official statement from the new acting head of House Fetus. The blonde figure sneers, remarking that whenever he sees swarms of insects like this gathered together, he feels the urge to crush them beneath his feet. A young man stands in a forest clearing, boots pressing into fallen leaves, muttering to himself that this stretch of woods should be the medium-sized animal zone. Standing confidently with a small squirrel perched on his shoulder, he remarks that he has already secured enough small animals like foxes and rodents, and wonders aloud whether he should start aiming for bigger game. He lifts the squirrel from his shoulder, scolding it playfully for continuing to sneak along after him, warning that this part of the forest is far more dangerous than the small-sized animal zone. The squirrel squeaks in protest as he tucks it securely into his bag, telling it that if things turn dangerous, it will be hard for him to protect it, insisting that today, of all days, it really must stay behind and not follow him outside. Legs pounded against wet grass as a figure sprinted through the forest, screaming in raw panic with every stride. A monstrous wolf tore through the brush behind him, jaws wide and teeth bared, closing the distance fast. Clutched in his hand was a small, terrified squirrel he refused to let go of. He shouted at the creature in his grip, demanding to know why it had provoked the wolf in the first place, while the squirrel only squeaked back in protest. Minutes earlier, things had gone differently. The wolf had seemed calm, even friendly, and all he needed to do was touch its nape and slip away unnoticed. He'd murmured praise to it, treating the beast like an obedient pet. That calm shattered instantly. The squirrel let out a piercing shriek, and the wolf's expression twisted into fury. He rounded on the squirrel, demanding an explanation for picking a fight with the wolf at the worst possible moment, telling it that if it wanted to die, it should do so alone. Rain poured down as the wolf gained ground, its massive frame gliding through the underbrush. He asked himself desperately what animal he should transform into. Next to escape, no land creature would outrun the wolf, he realized. And there wasn't time left to shift into a crow and take to the sky. A single thought struck him: if only he could run and fly at once. Frustration burned across his face as the impossible wish repeated in his mind. Then, unexpectedly, his body responded. The squirrel form he'd taken blinked in confusion, letting out a small, questioning squeak as something shifted. The wolf loomed closer, growling low before baring its teeth in a menacing grin, certain its prey had nowhere left to go. But the ground fell away. He rose into open sky, sunlight breaking through scattered clouds above the treetops. Claws dug into stone as he clung to a cliffside, breathless but safe, relieved that the chase had finally ended. Staring at his own reflection in his eye, he realized what had just happened. He'd suspected this ability held more depth than he first assumed. The truth unfolded before him. His transformation wasn't limited to a single form. A winged wolf soared through the mountain air, proving his power could be shaped and combined. Elsewhere, a group of nobles gathered in shadow, murmuring about Duke Fetus seizing an entire territory, defying the royal family itself to claim it as his own. Bystanders in a crowded street speculated about the family's collapsing reputation, wondering if the acting head had simply lost his mind, since madness seemed to run in the bloodline already. In a nearby town, a pair of men whispered about hidden treasure rumored to be buried close by, eager to be the first to find it. Two boys crouched in the dark, one gripping the other's shoulder, declaring that the moment had come to test their luck picking pockets among unsuspecting strangers. A hooded figure stood among cloaked companions, thoughts turning grim as he noted the Fetus family slide toward ruin, quietly questioning what game his ally Talon was really playing. A blue-haired young man in glasses stood before the temple's towering facade, silent as murmurs rippled through the crowd around him. He raised 2 fingers into the air, declaring a deadline for those still occupying the grounds. Any vagrants remaining after 2 months, he announced, would face severe punishment for defiling the holy temple's sanctity. A man in the crowd shouted back, demanding to know where they were meant to go if they were driven out, accusing him of sentencing them all to death. One boy asked his companion what had just been said from above, and was told sharply to stop worrying about it and run while there was still a chance. Nearby nobles exchanged doubtful murmurs, surprised that the supposedly soft-hearted acting head of the Fetus family wasn't showing the mercy they expected, speculating he was simply trying to avoid provoking the royal family. The young man turned back toward the restless crowd below, wondering aloud what exactly was happening among them. His thoughts drifted to a single word: a hospital. He announced that the Fetus family intended to build a hospital on that very ground, promising to train the vagrants themselves in medical arts to staff it. Confusion spread across his face as scattered voices in the crowd called the plan absurd, questioning why nobles shouldn't be the ones both teaching and learning medicine. 2 noble women sneered nearby, mocking the notion that anyone would send people to learn from a family already crumbling, certain it would only drag them deeper into ruin. A hooded figure walked through town, quietly noting that with the Fetus name being shunned everywhere, the odds of this plan succeeding sat at nearly 0. The blue-haired man admitted to himself that he'd overestimated one man's ability to help, deciding he could simply stop relying on him. A booming voice cut through the moment, demanding to know who dared laugh at that man, silencing the doubters instantly. An ornate carriage rolled through the street, its driver calling for everyone to clear the way as the horses trotted past startled onlookers. The carriage came to a halt, its door catching every eye as a figure stepped down from within. A high priest descended, declaring his support for Tulin Krisa, acting head of the Fetus ducal house, invoking God's name as he spoke. Bystanders gasped, recognizing the arrival and stammering out his title in disbelief. The young man dropped to his knees before the cathedral, hands clasped in a gesture of respect as the crowd watched in stunned silence. The priest greeted him warmly, extending a hand, while the young man scrambled up in flustered reverence, stammering out his greeting to the high priest before him. The high priest addressed the gathered crowd as lost children, calling them all travelers bound for the same destination. Temptation and evil would always linger along life's path, he warned, then asked how noble a man could truly be who cast others aside while claiming to walk righteously himself. A hooded figure smiled quietly, thinking of how the fetus family had been stained by a single sinner, and that particular sin could never be cleansed. Yet one person still tried to walk that difficult path despite everything. The priest continued, raising his hand toward the young man before him. He blessed the pitiful child of Aberon, undertaking this journey of atonement, asking that he find fulfillment beneath God's grace. Deeply touched, the young man thanked him for such precious words, while the priest brushed off the gratitude, insisting he couldn't stand by while the fetus family pursued something so faithful. The priest proposed they ride together into the temple, adding that since they'd come this far, they ought to pay respects to Sierra the Great as well. Grateful words followed on the surface, but privately the young man cursed him, certain the old man had only shown up to perform for an audience. He recalled how the fetus family was covering every expense of the project, yet the priest's condition had been that the temple receive half the profits from both the hospital and the academy. Imagining the width of that smile, he understood exactly how pleased the priest must have been to strike such a deal. Regardless of the outcome, he told himself, he had no regrets about the choice he'd made, since winning over the high priest had been essential to moving the plan forward. A hooded man greeted him warmly as young Master Milio, remarking it was good to see him again. Startled, the young man wondered silently, since when Milio had noticed his presence at all, Milio only replied that the world wasn't so easily overturned, brushing off any deeper explanation. Elsewhere, a furious blonde noble smashed his fist through stone, demanding to know what that damned old geezer was thinking and why he'd suddenly shown up at all. His companion explained that the acting head had simply used his brain, reasoning that if the high priest backed him publicly, the nobles would have no choice but to fall in line. Baring his teeth, the blonde man snarled that the insect had actually tried using his head for once, promising the next emperor of Aberon had nothing left to worry about. Too angry to listen further, he stormed off, declaring he needed to kill someone just to cool down, while his companion mocked him for having plenty of insects nearby to crush instead. Later, calm again, the blonde man sipped from a glass by a window, murmuring a thoughtful hum to himself. His aide confirmed that the current acting head of the fetus ducal house was indeed Tolan Krisa, the third son of Count Krisa's family, who had served as the late Duke Agony Fetus's aide for 13 years. The blonde noble swirled his wine, muttering that something had been grating on his nerves lately. Without warning, he lashed out, slamming his aide's head into the wall hard enough to draw blood. Sneering down at him, he added that having the man stand there silently only made his temper worse. Blood ran down the aide's face as he bowed his head and murmured an apology. Walking away, the noble remarked that his aide's refusal to scream or flinch made him boring, though admittedly, that same quality was exactly why he kept him around. The aide simply repeated his apology. Waving him off, the noble said that if the man insisted on being dull, he should at least make himself useful, ordering him to dig through 5 years of Count Krisa's family tax records. Should he find even a hint of irregularity, he was to arrest Count Krisa on the spot, and if nothing turned up, to fabricate evidence and arrest him regardless, then quietly tidy up the mess afterward. Kneeling among shattered porcelain, the aide gathered the pieces and answered simply, addressing him as Your Highness. Alone again, the prince leaned back in his chair, grumbling that the first prince's body was deteriorating faster than anyone expected, calling the whole situation irritating. He fell quiet for a moment, then added bitterly that the man's repeated recovery was just as annoying as his decline. Morning light spilled through the arched window of the estate as footsteps echoed down the hall. A voice called out from beyond the door, announcing the arrival of an aide named Pale, to see the acting head. Inside the study, Pale delivered his report. Construction preparations for the new hospital were complete, and nobles eager to study and teach medicine had already filled every available spot. The acting head simply nodded, satisfied with the progress. But the news wasn't all good. Pale's expression tightened as he raised the lingering problem. Vagrants still crowding the central district, with the 2-month deadline for clearing them rapidly closing in. Pale offered to send word to the Knight Commander to mobilize troops for the cleanup. The acting head refused. There was no need to drag Jack into this. He already had another plan in mind. Pale accepted the order without question. Before leaving, he added one more piece of news. A letter had just arrived from House Krisa, addressed directly to the acting head. The acting head unrolled the letter himself, surprised that his birth family had reached out first. Suspicion crept into his thoughts. Something was clearly being planned this late in the game. The letter revealed its contents. Izio Krisa, heir of House Krisa, intended to pay a personal visit to the fetus ducal house. The acting head's calm cracked for a moment. The word brother escaped his lips, laced with disbelief at the unexpected move from his estranged family. 2 weeks passed. In the Krisa estate, a maid stood trembling before a set of grand doors, hesitating before finally pushing them open to face what waited inside. Elsewhere, a quiet cup of tea was poured. Steam curled into the air as a tense silence settled between two figures, preparing to discuss matters far heavier than the drink between them. Ego Krisa, eldest son of House Krisa, sat comfortably with his tea and delivered grim news. Count Krisa, his own father, had been placed under house arrest the night before. The reason soon followed. An imperial tax audit, ordered directly by the royal family, had uncovered several irregularities in the count's finances. If proven, he could face imprisonment in an imperial prison. His younger brother, seated across from him, asked quietly whether their father could truly have done such a thing. Igio didn't answer directly. He simply stated that their house was now in crisis. The younger brother pushed further, insisting their father had never chased pleasure or ambition. He had always lived a diligent, quiet life, hardly the profile of a man hiding financial corruption. A stern voice cut through the tension, addressing the younger brother by name Tolan and questioning whether he truly had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. Igo's composure slipped into something colder. He asked if Tolan wanted to hear him admit that he himself was the reason their family had fallen into this ruin. The scene shifted back to the estate, where an unnamed noble leaned over his tea, mentioning an interesting story. He'd recently heard that vagrants from the Central Land were being put to work at a construction site. He pressed further, questioning whether food and shelter were being offered in exchange for labor, noting how convenient it was that the site needed workers, just as public order needed vagrants removed. The acting head, working humbly among the poor himself, ladling food into children's bowls, replied without hesitation. Whether the fetus ducal house became a relief center or a symbol of charity was not his concern. The mood shifted violently. A furious voice declared what truly worried him: the first prince had wanted every vagrant in the Central Land wiped out entirely. Behind him, the acting head's eyes went cold with quiet realization. The acting head warned Igo bluntly, telling him to leave if he had only come to waste time with pointless talk. Igio replied without hesitation, stating that he was now a member of the fetus family. Igo's expression remained composed as he urged Tolan to reconsider carefully, reminding him that the Count, whatever his crimes, was still his father. Tolan's jaw tightened. He asked coldly whether his father had already cast him aside 13 years ago, the old wound resurfacing beneath his calm exterior. Elsewhere, deep within a torch-lit underground corridor, a robed figure muttered in frustration, questioning when the tiresome ritual preparations would finally come to an end. The first princess, dressed in ceremonial white, complained openly. She understood the importance of the Tina's ritual, but resented being locked away in the underground sanctuary for so long. Her irritation deepened as she admitted that being cooped up all day with nothing but servants for company was driving her to the edge of her patience. Suddenly, a woman in a dark red dress appeared before her in the corridor, startling the princess and cutting off her private grumbling. The woman froze, recognizing who stood before her. She stammered out a title of respect, addressing the princess as Your Majesty, then hesitantly called her Lady Mental. The princess responded smoothly, greeting the woman warmly and asking if she had come all this way just to see her. Lady Mental, however, questioned whether the princess intended to leave her post at this very moment. Lady Mental reminded her that preparations for the ritual were still ongoing in the prayer room. The princess brushed off the concern with a teasing remark, surprised that Mental was suddenly so worried about her. Mental's expression grew serious. She explained that she couldn't help but worry, since the princess was the daughter she herself had carried and raised. Not a single day passed in peace for her because of constant fear that something might go wrong. The princess smiled, calling Mental unusually affectionate today, and suggested they enjoy tea beneath the open sky together for the first time in a long while. Before the moment could settle, the princess added abruptly that she had already seen Mental's face and needed to leave now. Claiming she had an important appointment with the emperor, she advised Mental to return to her post immediately. As she walked deeper into the torch-lit corridor, the princess reasoned to herself that with the Tina's ritual so close, the emperor should have been remaining inside the castle. Doubt crept into her mind. She wondered whether Mental's claim had been an insincere lie or something truly urgent, and privately admitted it might have been better if her ability had worked on her. Her footsteps echoed steadily through the stone hallway before abruptly coming to a stop, the sound cutting off mid-stride. Her expression shifted from calm suspicion to sharp alertness, her eyes narrowing as something seemed to catch her attention in the silence. She turned back toward the dark passage behind her, staring into the shadows as if sensing something unseen lurking within the corridor. Far from the castle, under an open sky, a small bird darted through the clouds before a sudden burst of light and motion shattered the calm below, accompanied by a sharp squeak. Deep in the forest, a small striped creature clung desperately to a vine, trembling as it climbed higher into the leaves, fleeing whatever chaos had just erupted beneath it. After crashing through the forest, a man pressed his hand against a tree trunk, coughing violently. Relief washed over him as he confirmed he was still alive. He examined his own reflection with growing unease, realizing his ability was stranger than he first thought. He could not only transform into animals, but combine different species however he pleased. Stumbling forward, he wondered aloud how such a powerful ability could come without a cost. There had to be some kind of drawback hidden beneath its surface. Sweat dripped down his face as he considered the possibility that overusing his power might be shortening his lifespan. Still, something about the sudden change in his body felt different from anything he'd guessed. Complaining that the heat felt unbearable that day, he lost his balance entirely and crashed face first into the ground, limbs sprawled out beside him. A small striped creature scurried close, tilting its head curiously at the motionless man before letting out a soft, questioning squeak. The creature prodded at him repeatedly with its tiny paws, receiving only silence in return, before hopping backward and bracing itself against a nearby stump. With a sharp cry, the creature launched into a spinning leap, gathering momentum in a small display of triumph despite the unconscious man lying beside it. Crossing its arms with a satisfied huff, the creature turned to ask if he had truly lost consciousness, clearly unconvinced by his stillness. Behind them, another figure loomed silently, remarking on what a weak fellow the man appeared to be as blood trickled down nearby claws. Startled, the small creature spun around, only to come face to face with a massive wolf, its jaws stretched wide in a furious, deafening roar. The wolf snapped at the smaller creature, ordering it to stay quiet and pointing out that the man was clearly sleeping. Sparks of static crackling between them, the little creature bit back, accusing the wolf of holding a grudge simply because it had been bitten earlier while only trying to play for the first time in ages. The wolf lowered itself defensively, whimpering as it clarified who it meant, gesturing toward the still, unconscious man lying just beyond its paws. The small creature burst into laughter, unable to hold back its amusement at the wolf's reaction, practically glowing with delight at having gotten under its skin. The wolf's expression shifted entirely, its playful anger replaced by something far more alert as its eyes locked onto something unseen, breath quickening. Ah, radiant. Ghostly figure rose from where the man lay, and a voice explained that they had seen it with their own eyes now. This child was the very human they had been waiting for. The wolf threw its head back and howled into the sky, the sound echoing outward as birds perched on a nearby branch stirred, sensing the shift in the forest's air. A stag and its young stood alert among the trees as the message spread, instructed to pass word to every animal in the forest the moment the time came. The glowing figure spoke once more, declaring that the being they had all waited for had finally appeared, its voice carrying across the forest like a quiet promise fulfilled. Still weak, the man remained asleep on the grass, his body resting beneath the golden light, yet the peace surrounding him would not last much longer. In the capital city, two men lounged near a lush garden path, discussing gossip about the powerful fetus family. They had heard the family, known for their wealth, was constructing a hospital nearby, but rumor now said they had also broken ground on a relief shelter for the homeless. Sitting on a marble railing overlooking the palace gardens, a young man with tousled blonde hair and rings under his eyes stretched lazily. Beside him, another blonde man crossed his arms, remarking dryly that the common folk seemed to be needling his companion on purpose, comparing their persistence to swarming insects that remained insignificant no matter their numbers. The first man's expression darkened. He sneered that the people bothering him were beggars unworthy of comparison to his own status, muttering in frustration that thinking about the matter only made his irritation grow. He continued venting, saying that if his original plans had gone smoothly, the troublesome commoners would have already been dealt with, and by now he'd be free to focus on his next ambitious project. Just then, a servant rushed up, startled to find both princes present. The servant bowed low, greeting the two royals with formal respect. The first prince, sprawled comfortably across the stone bench, acknowledged the timing with a smug remark about the coincidence of running into them there. The servant praised the reclining prince for his outstanding performance during the recent evening ritual, marveling aloud at the sheer strength of his mana, calling it extraordinary. Encouraged, the servant declared confidently that this prince was clearly the one fated to shape the empire of Aberon going forward. The second prince, standing nearby with arms folded, simply agreed without hesitation. Later, alone with his thoughts, the first prince smiled to himself in the shadows, admitting that when the day of his ascension finally arrived, his feelings would be mixed, joyful, yet tinged with sorrow, since it would mean rarely seeing his beloved younger brother again. The scene shifted to a tense exchange between the same prince and a third sibling, sweat visible on the younger man's brow. The elder demanded loyalty once he became emperor, insisting the younger fulfill his duties at the empire's distant border regions. The younger man's face went pale as he stammered out a question about being sent to the border. Nervously, the younger prince agreed to accept whatever role was given, so long as it was entrusted to him. In the background, the second prince listened with a knowing smirk, aware that new emperors traditionally granted their siblings positions immediately upon taking the throne, a custom meant to prevent future power struggles within the royal family. Aunts alone. The second prince reflected bitterly. Their brother had, in that moment, all but sealed the fate of this pitiful third prince, ensuring he'd be exiled from the comfort of the capital to live out his days in the harsh borderlands. Walking away down a sunlit garden path, the second prince acknowledged a deeper truth. The eldest brother had always intended to push every one of his younger siblings out of the capital, eventually. Everyone, that is, except for one particular sibling later. The two brothers spoke candidly. One chided the other for revealing the truth to their sibling too soon, saying it made him look unnecessarily pitiful. The other countered that if exile was inevitable, it was kinder to warn him early. Teasing followed, with one brother suggesting the other simply hand over his own demanding position as the emperor's aide to their exiled sibling instead. The response came sharp with sarcasm, admitting that escaping such an exhausting workload actually sounded rather appealing. Shifting topics, one prince asked whether his companion had given more thought to something mentioned previously, referring specifically to a bold, bespectacled man connected to the fetus family. The other recalled the man casually, admitting his impression of him hadn't been bad at all, smirking. One of the brothers suggested that rather than remaining idle and passive for an entire year, causing some mischief instead would prove far more entertaining. The story shifted to a carriage traveling briskly through the city streets, its passengers discussing business. One mentioned a newly discovered coal mine in the Southern Territories, currently under the ownership of a nobleman known as Baron Jones. Details emerged that Baron Jones had once borrowed a substantial sum from the fetus ducal house. The order was given to convert the accumulated debt and interest into formal management rights over the mine itself, which a nearby aide immediately accepted, addressing his superior as acting head. In a follow-up meeting, the acting head asked for a status report on the mine's workers. His nervous aide admitted that following a recent speech, a number of employees had temporarily abandoned their posts, hinting at unrest simmering beneath the surface of the family's ambitious expansion. The acting head of the fetus ducal house reported to his subordinate that the Central Land Project had brought stability to the region, despite earlier setbacks. His companion, seated across from him, nodded and instructed him to continue monitoring the situation closely. The subordinate hesitated before adding one more piece of news he had failed to mention earlier. A message had arrived that very morning from House Krisa, carrying information he clearly found troubling. He revealed that Count Krisa, the young man's own father, had been imprisoned within the Imperial dungeon. The acting head's expression remained frozen, saying nothing in response. Sitting in stunned silence inside the moving carriage, he reflected bitterly on the timing of the news, noting it had struck on the very day he was scheduled to attend a nobles' meeting at the invitation of the imperial family itself. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to make sense of the arrest. He hadn't done anything to offend the royal family directly, he reasoned, unless the reason traced back to his ongoing relief efforts for the vagrants. A darker suspicion crept into his mind. Perhaps the Empire intended to isolate and suffocate anyone connected to reform, one by one, punishing them as the cost of defying the established order they called divine. His companion glanced back with concern, asking if he was all right. The acting head quickly composed himself, assuring the man there was nothing to worry about. As their carriage approached the sprawling grounds of the meeting hall, his aide offered him medicine for a headache, but he declined, explaining the drowsiness it caused wasn't worth the risk with the destination minutes away. Stepping out, he only remarked on the sheer size of the garden before him. Word spread quickly through the hall as attendants announced his arrival, identifying him formally as the acting head of the fetus ducal house. He walked forward across the polished floor, the eyes of gathered nobles following his every step. He said nothing, keeping his expression unreadable as he passed through the crowd. A cheerful noble stepped forward to greet him, introducing himself warmly as Duke Milio and claiming he had heard a great deal about the acting head already. Duke Milio praised his efforts at the fetus estate, calling the scale of his current project remarkable for something undertaken in the very heart of the empire. The acting head deflected the compliment, crediting High Priest Vesper and the grace of the imperial family instead. Duke Milio laughed heartily, mentioning that his own son had personally witnessed the events unfolding in the Central Land, describing the acting head as strikingly composed while standing beside the high priest. His tone shifted, growing colder as he remarked that had the late agony fetus lived to see such an impressive scene, the man would never have dared imagine betraying the empire the way he ultimately did. Duke Milio continued needling him, suggesting that considerable effort would be required to properly educate the young duke left behind, adding that it would be troublesome indeed if he followed his father's path and turned traitor as well. The acting head responded evenly, turning the subject back toward Milio's own son, confirming he meant the young lord he had personally encountered that day. He described the boy sharply, comparing him to a rat hiding among the crowd, with his face concealed beneath a robe, questioning aloud whether such behavior reflected the education Duke Milio's household prided itself on. Milio's composure cracked instantly, his face twisting in fury as he spat an insult back at him. Unshaken, the acting head pressed further, pointing out that Milio had likely been relying on Baron Jones' newly discovered coal mine, only to reveal that ownership of that very mine would soon transfer to House Fetus. He added coolly that should Fetus refuse to supply minerals going forward, Milio's own businesses would face serious trouble. Milio stood rigid, humiliated, and silent, as the acting head calmly advised him to choose his words more carefully, depending on the time and situation, walking past him with quiet authority intact. Inside the grand meeting hall, an announcer called for silence as the massive doors swung open, declaring that the first prince and second prince were entering. Rows of assembled nobles straightened at once, tension rippling through the room as the two princes made their approach, every eye tracking their movement with visible unease. Dressed in matching white and gold military uniforms, the two brothers walked side by side across the polished floor, their footsteps echoing through the silent chamber. A memory surfaced in Talon Kreese's mind, the voice of the first prince cutting through his thoughts, demanding to know whether he felt nothing after killing Duke Fetus with his own hands. The prince's cold, golden eyes lingered in Talon's memory, sharp and unreadable, watching him as though searching for some flicker of guilt. Startled back to the present, Talon flinched, rain-soaked memories fading as he found himself once again standing in the meeting hall, sweat beading on his brow. The first prince took his seat at the head of the long table, formally opening the session and instructing everyone present to sit. Outside the tall windows, the discussion moved forward, wrapping up matters concerning the empire's border territories before shifting focus elsewhere. The prince turned his attention to the ongoing development of the Central Land within the imperial capital, asking directly for an update on House Fetus's progress. Tolan rose sharply to his feet, announcing himself as acting head of the Fetus Ducal House, ready to deliver his report. He explained that construction of the new hospital had reached its structural framing stage, while medical staff were simultaneously being trained and relief efforts extended to the surrounding slum district. The first prince recalled the origin of the project aloud, remembering how he had once been granted development rights to the Central Land beside the temple as a reward for winning the previous hunting festival. He continued, his tone hardening, recounting how Agony Fetus had later appeared and seized that authority away from him, remarking bitterly that this was apparently what had become of it since. Turning to another matter, he stated that recent reports showed public safety near the capital center had improved considerably, a claim the second prince confirmed beside him. The first prince credited the Fetus family's hospital project entirely for the shift, noting that the effort had already earned widespread praise among the empire's citizens. Cracking his knuckles with visible satisfaction, he addressed Talon directly, calling the achievement something worth praising, and adding that he held high expectations for his future. Rising with a confident smirk, the prince turned toward the other assembled nobles, comparing them unfavorably to House Fetus, declaring that a family capable of such results truly deserved the imperial family's continued support. Tolan bowed his head, expressing that he felt deeply honored by the prince's words, and vowing to carry the project forward with the utmost sense of responsibility. The prince leaned in close, his tone shifting subtly, remarking that humility was admirable, but pointed out that humility alone could not feed the people who depended on the project's success. He added, with a faint and knowing smile, that by imperial decree he held no authority to interfere directly in the development project himself, but suggested that managing something of such scale entirely alone must surely place a heavy burden on the fetus family. The first prince assured Toland that the imperial family would provide as much support as necessary, adding pointedly that assistance would come only if House Fetus formally requested it. Toland's eye narrowed behind his glasses, sweat forming as he registered the implication. A faded memory surfaced in his mind, an old photograph of a boy standing beside a tall figure in a dark military uniform, a gentle hand resting on the child's shoulder. Toland's expression tightened further, the weight of the moment pressing on him as he studied the prince's unreadable smile. Steeling himself, he bowed low and made his request, explaining that the hospital project currently lacked sufficient professional personnel and equipment to move forward as planned. The prince's smile sharpened, his eyes gleaming as he replied that should the imperial family choose to lend their assistance, House Fetus would never forget such generosity. Latter alone with his thoughts near a window overlooking the gardens, the prince's expression settled into something colder and more calculating, his reflection framed against the trees outside. A dark shape perched silently among the branches, its owner reflecting that he hadn't been able to pay close attention to matters lately, having spent a long stretch away in the forest. Rain fell steadily as a young man in a deep blue military uniform stood beneath the dripping branches, a red-eyed bird resting nearby. He mused quietly that perhaps it was finally time to re-establish some discipline. The nobles' meeting inside the grand hall came to a close, and dignitaries filed out through the towering doors one by one. Officials descended the marble staircase in silence, their expressions unreadable, each carrying the weight of whatever had just been decided behind those closed doors. A carriage waited outside the estate as one attendant thanked another for the day's effort. A young servant with teal hair turned toward the man beside the carriage, his voice hesitant as he asked what exactly had unfolded during the meeting. Toland, sharp-eyed behind round glasses, gave a curt order to return to the ducal house immediately. His companion lowered his head and confirmed the instruction without hesitation, understanding that something serious had transpired. A voice called out to Toland just as he prepared to depart, questioning why he seemed so eager to leave the grounds so soon after the meeting ended. Igo approached from behind, his cloak trailing against the stone path, wondering aloud how long Toland had been standing there. He revealed that word of the meeting had already reached him, adding that the first prince had apparently pledged his support. An older noble spoke with a stern expression, remarking that gratitude was owed for the prince's favor. He noted that because of this arrangement, Count Chrysa would soon be released from custody. Toland's gaze hardened as he clarified his true motive. The support he had sought from the prince, he explained, existed for one purpose alone: securing the future of the fetus family. Declaring that he needed to leave, Toland turned away from Igo, who called after him with a suggestion. Perhaps, Igo proposed, he should visit the count's estate first and pay his respects to their father. Toland's expression twisted with sudden irritation. He questioned since when their relationship had grown close enough to justify sitting together without purpose. Laughter echoed against a backdrop of drifting clouds. Someone recalled the acting head's expression during the meeting, clearly savoring the memory. Two blonde figures strolled through the garden, one of them laughing openly while recounting how desperate the man had looked while pleading. He compared it to watching a prized project get ripped away all over again. The pair continued walking, their tone shifting toward scheming satisfaction. Now, they agreed, they could meddle with the Central Land project however they wished, hiding their interference behind the guise of generous support. One of them wondered gleefully whether they should simply destroy the hospital right before its completion. The taller of the two smiled with quiet confidence, insisting that either outcome would prove entertaining. Should anything go wrong, he added, the blame would fall entirely on someone else's shoulders. Turning serious for a moment, he mentioned it was time to think about their next move and floated the idea of continuing the conversation somewhere more private. His companion cleared his throat awkwardly, suggesting they postpone that particular discussion for another occasion instead. Claiming exhaustion, the blonde prince announced his intention to retire to his chambers and rest. His brother watched him walk away, calling out uncertainly, clearly caught off guard by the abrupt change in mood. Left alone in thought, the prince rubbed his chin, murmuring about heading toward his room, his expression shifting into something more contemplative than before. Elsewhere, a figure with piercing golden eyes observed the pattern forming. He noted how often the prince had been retreating to his room lately, questioning quietly what could possibly be drawing him there so frequently. The doors were forced open with a sharp motion. Frustration colored the prince's voice as he complained about his good mood being ruined, grumbling about having to face that particular person's presence once again. Inside, a dark-haired figure sat relaxed behind a desk, hands folded behind his head as he greeted the intruder with casual amusement, asking if he had finally arrived. The prince's eyes widened in shock, and a scream of pure disbelief tore through the room. The dark-haired man leaned back in his chair, demanding to know what the intruder wanted and how he had slipped into the office once again. The visitor merely stated that ways existed for such things, then noted with amusement that the satisfied smile on his face suggested the meeting had gone rather well. Caught off guard, the blond man stammered before catching himself, dismissing the question entirely. Composing himself, he suggested they simply get through today's session and be done with it. Before proceeding, the seated man mentioned he had a small favor to request. His counterpart, standing near the window, repeated the word back with visible suspicion. The favor became clear: permission to involve himself in the fetus family's central land project. Fury erupted across the blonde prince's face as he realized his rival already knew about the operation. The dark-haired man explained calmly that his only goal was ensuring the construction proceeded without incident, adding that it had nothing to do with the prince personally. The prince shot back that the phrase "without incident" was exactly what worried him. Turning toward the window, the schemer revealed his actual intention: delaying the construction for as long as possible, long enough for rumors to spread across the empire that the imperial family stood behind the fetus ducal house. Stunned by the admission, the prince could barely form words, asking what had just been said. Elsewhere, another figure watched a carriage roll away from the window, reflecting that he had anticipated Talon taking a different approach. A hospital, he admitted, was not what he had expected at all. He recalled that in the original course of events, Talon had raised an army instead. If circumstances had shifted so dramatically, he reasoned, then Talon himself must have changed as a person too. Back in the office, the blonde prince's restraint snapped entirely. Lightning crackled around him as he screamed, demanding to know how much longer he would be forced to obey, hurling an insult at the black-haired man standing calmly before him. Without turning around, the dark-haired man replied coldly that obedience was the one thing his rival happened to excel at. The prince's rage sharpened into words, spitting out that the man was nothing more than a puppet dancing on the second prince's strings, his blade crackling with energy as he prepared to strike. Unmoved by the threat, the target admitted growing tired of the exchange, urging a quick answer so they could move past it, asking sharply whether he needed to repeat himself for it to sink in. The scene shifted to a quiet study, where a hand pressed quill to paper, ink scratching steadily across the page. Across the room, another figure with pale teal hair sat hunched over his own letter, scrolls stacked beside him as he worked through the night. The teal-haired writer paused mid-sentence, questioning what it truly meant that support had come from the first prince, wondering if it signaled the abandoned ducal house had once again drawn the imperial family's attention. Two shadowed figures loomed over him as a reply came firm and final: there was no chance of that. The first prince's involvement, they explained, marked nothing less than the end for the fetus family, since he intended to personally crush the ducal house the moment it tried to rise again. Still uncertain, the young man wondered aloud whether it might be wiser to align with the ducal house ahead of time. His superior dismissed the idea, insisting it was still too early to commit, and that they should simply watch how events continued to unfold. In a grander hall, the golden-haired figure extended his hand, brushing aside any mention of favors owed and insisting instead that gratitude belonged to him. Because of Talon's request, he explained, he now had genuine purpose to involve himself in such a noble undertaking. Their hands met in a firm shake, sealed by a quiet promise that every word spoken had been meant sincerely. Alone with his thoughts, the dark-haired man's expression shifted into something colder and more determined, murmuring under his breath a private vow to prove himself, whatever it would take. A trembling hand pressed against the writing desk, absorbing the full weight of what imperial support truly meant beneath the surface. The pen scratched against paper as a man came to understand the cruel machinery hidden behind such generous promises. Sweat traced down his face as his eyes narrowed with rising unease. Slumped over his desk, he let out a pained groan, the burden of his thoughts pressing down on him physically. Breathing grew ragged as he clutched at his chest, forcing air into his lungs through gritted teeth. The pressure inside him built until he admitted aloud that the situation felt unbearable. He questioned whether this suffering stemmed from guilt over failing to protect the previous duke, or something worse, the fear that he might fail the young duke in the very same way. A grotesque vision surfaced in his mind, a towering figure looming over a kneeling man, forcing the question of how anyone could stand before something so far beyond human. He had no answer for how he should even begin to act. Turning his thoughts away from despair, he steadied himself with a single resolve. Whatever happened, he had to protect the young duke, no matter the cost. A knock echoed through the room, interrupting his spiral. A voice called out, asking whether Talon was inside. Beyond the door stood the young duke himself, fidgeting with the pendant at his collar as he explained how difficult it had become to see Talon lately, gently asking if he might be allowed inside. Panic flashed across Talon's face as he scrambled upright, urging the boy to wait, insisting that the timing wasn't right. Composing himself, Talon apologized quietly, explaining that something urgent demanded his attention at that very moment. The young duke's expression fell, disappointment evident despite his silence. Standing before the closed door, the boy accepted the refusal, promising instead that he would return once matters had settled, adding that he intended to visit again personally. Elsewhere, chains rattled against a clenched fist as a desperate voice cried out for mercy, begging to be released from captivity. An old man with wild gray hair pleaded on his knees, insisting he was nothing more than an ordinary elder who deserved freedom. He demanded to know how much longer his captors intended to keep him locked away, pointing out that over 2 months had already passed since his imprisonment began. A bald elder standing guard turned to his companion, confirming that they still had no explanation for how this prisoner had managed to enter their sacred cave in the first place. The younger guard recalled finding him unconscious in the middle of the cave, adding that despite repeated questioning, the old man had never given a clear account of how he got inside. Frustration boiled over as the prisoner shouted his innocence once more, insisting he had lost his footing and fallen from a cliff, only to wake up trapped inside the cave with no memory of how he arrived there. The hooded guards remained unconvinced, reminding him that the cave stood as sacred ground blessed by the god Amika, a place that could not simply be stumbled into by accident. The bald elder stroked his beard thoughtfully, considering a darker possibility. If the old man's story was a lie, it might mean a descendant of Aburan had discovered the location, raising the threat that Aburan's forces could invade the sanctuary itself. His younger companion studied the prisoner with cold calculation, noting that despite his age, the man appeared disciplined and well-trained. He suggested a chilling method to ensure compliance, blinding the prisoner or severing his ankles to guarantee he could never escape or reveal what he had seen. Desperation cracked through the old man's voice as he pleaded with his captors, begging to be sent home. He confessed that a young child waited for him, alone and unaware of what had happened to his grandfather. A hand gripped his beard roughly, silencing his protests. The bald elder leaned in close, his tone almost gentle despite the threat behind it, warning the prisoner that he would never leave this cave alive. Softening his stance slightly, the elder invoked the mercy of God Amika, offering the prisoner a choice. The old man's expression tightened, waiting to hear what fate awaited him. The first option was laid out plainly: spend the remainder of his life confined within these walls, forgotten by the outside world. The second option followed just as coldly: a swift death right there in the cave. The elder pressed him for an answer, demanding to know which path he would choose. The prisoner said nothing, his silence heavy with calculation rather than fear. Then, unexpectedly, laughter erupted from him, wild and unrestrained, echoing off the stone walls in a way that caught his captors off guard. Composing himself, the elder addressed him directly, urging him to listen carefully and stop wasting each other's time with games. The prisoner cut him off, declaring that he was far too old and far too experienced to fall for such simple tactics. Confusion flickered across the younger guard's face as he asked what exactly the old man meant by that statement. The prisoner's demeanor shifted entirely, his eyes sharpening with a knowing edge. He stated plainly that he understood something crucial: they could not kill him, no matter how convincing their threats appeared. The nobles' meeting inside the grand hall came to a close, and dignitaries filed out through the towering doors one by one. Officials descended the marble staircase in silence, their expressions unreadable, each carrying the weight of whatever had just been decided behind those closed doors. A carriage waited outside the estate as one attendant thanked another for the day's effort. A young servant with teal hair turned toward the man beside the carriage, his voice hesitant as he asked what exactly had unfolded during the meeting. Talon, sharp-eyed behind round glasses, gave a curt order to return to the ducal house immediately. His companion lowered his head and confirmed the instruction without hesitation, understanding that something serious had transpired. A voice called out to Talon just as he prepared to depart, questioning why he seemed so eager to leave the grounds so soon after the meeting ended. Igo approached from behind, his cloak trailing against the stone path, wondering aloud how long Talon had been standing there. He revealed that word of the meeting had already reached him, adding that the first prince had apparently pledged his support. An older noble spoke with a stern expression, remarking that gratitude was owed for the prince's favor. He noted that because of this arrangement, Count Krysa would soon be released from custody. Talon's gaze hardened as he clarified his true motive. The support he had sought from the prince, he explained, existed for one purpose alone: securing the future of the fetus family. Declaring that he needed to leave, Talon turned away from Igo, who called after him with a suggestion. Perhaps, Igo proposed, he should visit the count's estate first and pay his respects to their father. Talon's expression twisted with sudden irritation. He questioned since when their relationship had grown close enough to justify sitting together without purpose. Laughter echoed against a backdrop of drifting clouds. Someone recalled the acting head's expression during the meeting, clearly savoring the memory. Two blonde figures strolled through the garden, one of them laughing openly while recounting how desperate the man had looked while pleading. He compared it to watching a prized project get ripped away all over again. The pair continued walking, their tone shifting toward scheming satisfaction. Now, they agreed, they could meddle with the Central Land project however they wished, hiding their interference behind the guise of generous support. One of them wondered gleefully whether they should simply destroy the hospital right before its completion. The taller of the two smiled with quiet confidence, insisting that either outcome would prove entertaining. Should anything go wrong, he added, the blame would fall entirely on someone else's shoulders. Turning serious for a moment, he mentioned it was time to think about their next move and floated the idea of continuing the conversation somewhere more private. His companion cleared his throat awkwardly, suggesting they postpone that particular discussion for another occasion instead. Claiming exhaustion, the blonde prince announced his intention to retire to his chambers and rest. His brother watched him walk away, calling out uncertainly, clearly caught off guard by the abrupt change in mood. Left alone in thought, the prince rubbed his chin, murmuring about heading toward his room, his expression shifting into something more contemplative than before. Elsewhere, a figure with piercing golden eyes observed the pattern forming. He noted how often the prince had been retreating to his room lately, questioning quietly what could possibly be drawing him there so frequently. The doors were forced open with a sharp motion. Frustration colored the prince's voice as he complained about his good mood being ruined, grumbling about having to face that particular person's presence once again. Inside, a dark-haired figure sat relaxed behind a desk, hands folded behind his head as he greeted the intruder with casual amusement, asking if he had finally arrived. The prince's eyes widened in shock, and a scream of pure disbelief tore through the room. The dark-haired man leaned back in his chair, demanding to know what the intruder wanted and how he had slipped into the office once again. The visitor merely stated that ways existed for such things, then noted with amusement that the satisfied smile on his face suggested the meeting had gone rather well. Caught off guard, the blond man stammered before catching himself, dismissing the question entirely. Composing himself, he suggested they simply get through today's session and be done with it. Before proceeding, the seated man mentioned he had a small favor to request. His counterpart, standing near the window, repeated the word back with visible suspicion. The favor became clear: permission to involve himself in the fetus family's Central Land project. Fury erupted across the blonde prince's face as he realized his rival already knew about the operation. The dark-haired man explained calmly that his only goal was ensuring the construction proceeded without incident, adding that it had nothing to do with the prince personally. The prince shot back that the phrase "without incident" was exactly what worried him. Turning toward the window, the schemer revealed his actual intention: delaying the construction for as long as possible, long enough for rumors to spread across the empire that the imperial family stood behind the fetus ducal house. Stunned by the admission, the prince could barely form words, asking what had just been said. Elsewhere, another figure watched a carriage roll away from the window, reflecting that he had anticipated Talon taking a different approach. A hospital, he admitted, was not what he had expected at all. He recalled that in the original course of events, Talon had raised an army instead. If circumstances had shifted so dramatically, he reasoned, then Talon himself must have changed as a person too. Back in the office, the blonde prince's restraint snapped entirely. Lightning crackled around him as he screamed, demanding to know how much longer he would be forced to obey, hurling an insult at the black-haired man standing calmly before him. Without turning around, the dark-haired man replied coldly that obedience was the one thing his rival happened to excel at. The prince's rage sharpened into words, spitting out that the man was nothing more than a puppet dancing on the second prince's strings, his blade crackling with energy as he prepared to strike. Unmoved by the threat, the target admitted growing tired of the exchange, urging a quick answer so they could move past it, asking sharply whether he needed to repeat himself for it to sink in. The scene shifted to a quiet study, where a hand pressed quill to paper, ink scratching steadily across the page. Across the room, another figure with pale teal hair sat hunched over his own letter, scrolls stacked beside him as he worked through the night. The teal-haired writer paused mid-sentence, questioning what it truly meant that support had come from the first prince, wondering if it signaled the abandoned ducal house had once again drawn the imperial family's attention. Two shadowed figures loomed over him as a reply came firm and final: there was no chance of that. The first prince's involvement, they explained, marked nothing less than the end for the fetus family, since he intended to personally crush the ducal house the moment it tried to rise again. Still uncertain, the young man wondered aloud whether it might be wiser to align with the ducal house ahead of time. His superior dismissed the idea, insisting it was still too early to commit and that they should simply watch how events continued to unfold. In a grander hall, the golden-haired figure extended his hand, brushing aside any mention of favors owed and insisting instead that gratitude belonged to him. Because of Talon's request, he explained, he now had genuine purpose to involve himself in such a noble undertaking. Their hands met in a firm shake, sealed by a quiet promise that every word spoken had been meant sincerely. Alone with his thoughts, the dark-haired man's expression shifted into something colder and more determined, murmuring under his breath a private vow to prove himself, whatever it would take. A trembling hand pressed against the writing desk, absorbing the full weight of what imperial support truly meant beneath the surface. The pen scratched against paper as a man came to understand the cruel machinery hidden behind such generous promises. Sweat traced down his face as his eyes narrowed with rising unease. Slumped over his desk, he let out a pained groan, the burden of his thoughts pressing down on him physically. Breathing grew ragged as he clutched at his chest, forcing air into his lungs through gritted teeth. The pressure inside him built until he admitted aloud that the situation felt unbearable. He questioned whether this suffering stemmed from guilt over failing to protect the previous duke, or something worse, the fear that he might fail the young duke in the very same way. A grotesque vision surfaced in his mind, a towering figure looming over a kneeling man, forcing the question of how anyone could stand before something so far beyond human. He had no answer for how he should even begin to act. Turning his thoughts away from despair, he steadied himself with a single resolve. Whatever happened, he had to protect the young duke, no matter the cost. A knock echoed through the room, interrupting his spiral. A voice called out, asking whether Talon was inside. Beyond the door stood the young duke himself, fidgeting with the pendant at his collar as he explained how difficult it had become to see Talon lately, gently asking if he might be allowed inside. Panic flashed across Talon's face as he scrambled upright, urging the boy to wait, insisting that the timing wasn't right. Composing himself, Talon apologized quietly, explaining that something urgent demanded his attention at that very moment. The young duke's expression fell, disappointment evident despite his silence. Standing before the closed door, the boy accepted the refusal, promising instead that he would return once matters had settled, adding that he intended to visit again personally. Elsewhere, chains rattled against a clenched fist as a desperate voice cried out for mercy, begging to be released from captivity. An old man with wild gray hair pleaded on his knees, insisting he was nothing more than an ordinary elder who deserved freedom. He demanded to know how much longer his captors intended to keep him locked away, pointing out that over 2 months had already passed since his imprisonment began. A bald elder standing guard turned to his companion, confirming that they still had no explanation for how this prisoner had managed to enter their sacred cave in the first place. The younger guard recalled finding him unconscious in the middle of the cave, adding that despite repeated questioning, the old man had never given a clear account of how he got inside. Frustration boiled over as the prisoner shouted his innocence once more, insisting he had lost his footing and fallen from a cliff, only to wake up trapped inside the cave with no memory of how he arrived there. The hooded guards remained unconvinced, reminding him that the cave stood as sacred ground blessed by the god Amika, a place that could not simply be stumbled into by accident. The bald elder stroked his beard thoughtfully, considering a darker possibility. If the old man's story was a lie, it might mean a descendant of Aburen had discovered the location, raising the threat that Aburen's forces could invade the sanctuary itself. His younger companion studied the prisoner with cold calculation, noting that despite his age, the man appeared disciplined and well-trained. He suggested a chilling method to ensure compliance, blinding the prisoner or severing his ankles to guarantee he could never escape or reveal what he had seen. Desperation cracked through the old man's voice as he pleaded with his captors, begging to be sent home. He confessed that a young child waited for him, alone and unaware of what had happened to his grandfather. A hand gripped his beard roughly, silencing his protests. The bald elder leaned in close, his tone almost gentle despite the threat behind it, warning the prisoner that he would never leave this cave alive. Softening his stance slightly, the elder invoked the mercy of god Amika, offering the prisoner a choice. The old man's expression tightened, waiting to hear what fate awaited him. The first option was laid out plainly: spend the remainder of his life confined within these walls, forgotten by the outside world. The second option followed just as coldly: a swift death right there in the cave. The elder pressed him for an answer, demanding to know which path he would choose. The prisoner said nothing, his silence heavy with calculation rather than fear. Then, unexpectedly, laughter erupted from him, wild and unrestrained, echoing off the stone walls in a way that caught his captors off guard. Composing himself, the elder addressed him directly, urging him to listen carefully and stop wasting each other's time with games. The prisoner cut him off, declaring that he was far too old and far too experienced to fall for such simple tactics. Confusion flickered across the younger guard's face as he asked what exactly the old man meant by that statement. The prisoner's demeanor shifted entirely, his eyes sharpening with a knowing edge. He stated plainly that he understood something crucial. They could not kill him, no matter how convincing their threats appeared. Deep inside a dark cavern, a white-haired man sits bound, a wooden plaque hanging around his neck. 4 cloaked figures stand behind iron bars, watching him from a distance. Calmly, he asks what they mean by their words, then states plainly that he already knows they can never kill him. The declaration catches 2 hooded guards off guard. They exchange a wary glance in front of the cell. One of them, a sharp-eyed young man named Ren, studies the prisoner in silence. An elderly bald man with a long beard steps forward, repeating the prisoner's claim with open doubt. He demands to know what makes the prisoner so certain his life is safe in their hands. The prisoner counters that if they had truly meant to kill him, torture would have come long ago. Instead of being harmed, he has only been kept locked away this entire time. He pushes the reasoning further, concluding that the intent to kill was never there to begin with. There must be another reason they refused to lay a hand on him, he says, adding that he can see fear hidden behind the elder's eyes. Sweat forms on the elder's brow as his expression hardens. He admits that the prisoner may believe he has hidden it well, but he has seen eyes like those more than once before. Ren, the dark-haired young man, finally speaks up. He turns the question back, demanding to know exactly what it is they are so afraid of. With pointed insistence, Ren voices the unspoken fear that God Amika himself chose the prisoner and brought him here. The question is met with a heavy, uneasy silence from the elder. Another young man, addressed as Raytel, approaches the elder and asks what should be done about the situation. The elder only stares ahead without answering. The elder's tense expression breaks into a wide grin as he scratches the back of his head, laughing it off. He concedes that their secret has apparently been discovered. The scene shifts to a sky burning with sunset colors. Ren introduces himself to the prisoner, mentioning that he has heard his name is Jing. Ren explains that the elder has ordered him to show Jing around Amika's domain, inviting him to walk along. Jing agrees briefly, then reflects inwardly that even if this is only freedom under close watch, they are at least kind enough to grant him a tour. As they walk through the open field, Jing's thoughts circle back to suspicion. He wonders what would happen if he truly were an imperial spy, and questions why they seem so confident he could never escape. Ren gestures toward a vast city spread beneath the fading light, a single beam of brightness rising from its center. He explains that this is where those who serve Amika have lived in hiding. The streets below bustle with ordinary townsfolk going about their lives. Ren notes that by Amika's blessing, they live humble lives while quietly carrying out a sacred mission passed down through generations. Scanning his surroundings, Jing notices no soldiers or anyone fit for battle among the crowd. He wonders silently whether this place has truly never been invaded in all its history. Jing looks up at the sky, awash in shades of purple and orange, and admits how beautiful it is. He questions whether the sky here is truly different from the one back in Abiren, the world he once knew. The story shifts to a shadowed robed figure identified as God Amika, a vanished deity whose face has long since been forgotten. Very little remains known about those who still hold on to faith in him. Memory drifts to the past, where a young man with a blindfold sits at a table during his early education as heir. He recalls hearing, back then, that every last remnant of Amika's followers had already been captured. In the study lined with old books, a man in a military coat clenches his fist, recalling his father's proud words. His father had once boasted that the fetus ducal house had led the imperial family to victory once again, crushing the barbarians for good. His grin widens as the memory sharpens further. Those dangerous, violent heretics his father spoke of had finally been wiped out, or so the family had always claimed with pride. The scene shifts to a battlefield stained with blood. A weathered knight, his armor soaked in gore, stands beneath a darkening sky and admits, with a heavy heart, that he too had killed countless heretics in that campaign. Behind him lies a fallen figure, a young life cut short and left motionless on the scorched ground. The knight turns away, his sword dripping, his expression hollow with the weight of what he has done. A grieving child clutches someone close, tears streaming down his face as he holds on tightly. Nearby, another set of eyes burns with quiet fury, fixed on the destruction surrounding them. The knight raises his blade toward the smoke-filled sky, standing protectively in front of a young boy. Fire and ruin stretch out behind them as the battle reaches its brutal end. A blade catches the last light, gleaming amid falling ash and debris. The violence of that day lingers in the image, a single sword suspended between darkness and fire. Seham devwana den hiuhundo hiden fine folkajus ram. Imenadrat hisden de help he lingers calm in trimpoinad has been delayed once again, and his patience is wearing thin. A servant with pale features explains the situation carefully, admitting that the promised materials still haven't arrived. According to the Imperial side, everything will need until next week to be sorted out. The blue-haired man presses his fist to his mouth, visibly agitated. He points out how absurd it seems that even something as extravagant as a winged wolf could be secured with ease, yet plain building materials keep getting delayed. Gold coins scatter through the air above a half-finished building, illustrating the mounting cost of every lost day. At this pace, he realizes, the construction schedule will inevitably be pushed further and further back. His expression darkens as a grim conclusion forms in his mind. The fetus family, he suspects, is being deliberately driven toward financial ruin, and he begins to wonder whether this was the first prince's intention from the very beginning. The young man voices his frustration aloud, admitting that time is running dangerously short. He blames himself for not managing the situation sooner, feeling the pressure close in around him. Standing before someone seated with their head in their hands, he offers a sincere apology. The reply comes short and clipped, a single word of grudging acceptance that ends the tense exchange. Dismissed from the room, he steps out through a grand set of double doors, letting out a quiet breath of relief. The tension of the meeting slowly drains from his shoulders as he walks away. His thoughts drift elsewhere as he walks down the corridor, weighed down by concern. Talon's condition, he reflects, has taken a serious turn for the worse, and there seems to be nothing he can do to help. Peering around a doorway, he wonders anxiously what might happen if things continue to decline at this rate. A young boy nearby glances back at him, curious, asking why he looks so gloomy. Startled by the sudden question, the man jumps back in surprise, flailing dramatically. The boy questions his pale expression, catching him completely off guard. Quickly composing himself, the man apologizes for startling the child before him. The boy's eyes widen in shock as he suddenly realizes exactly who he is speaking to, addressing him nervously as the young duke. The boy bows immediately, offering his own apology for having spoken so suddenly. Waving off the gesture, the man insists there is no need to worry, admitting he had simply been lost in his own thoughts. A young boy peers around a corner, asking hesitantly whether Talon is currently in his office. Sweat beads on his forehead as he waits for an answer. A servant confirms that Talon is indeed there, offering to inform him right away that the young duke wishes to speak with him. The boy quickly waves off the offer, explaining that Talon looks busy and he doesn't want to interrupt. He admits the real reason behind his question, confessing that he had overheard something through a window earlier. He asks quietly whether the construction project has been delayed once again. Caught off guard, the servant stammers, struggling to find the right words to respond to such a direct question. The boy simply stares back, waiting silently for an answer that doesn't come easily. The servant reassures him gently, insisting it isn't something the young duke needs to worry about. There are only a few matters still being settled with the imperial family, he explains. Relief washes over the boy's face as he accepts the explanation. With a cheerful wave, the servant announces he'll be heading off now, encouraging the boy to keep up the good work. The boy responds warmly, wishing him a safe journey. Once alone, the boy's expression shifts into something more composed and knowing, the friendly mask falling away as his true thoughts settle beneath the surface. Later, he sits curled up in front of a grand set of doors, his face buried against his knees. A soft tapping sound breaks the silence, drawing his attention upward. His eyes widen as he spots a familiar figure perched outside the window. He calls out excitedly, recognizing the crow immediately as Blackie. Rushing to the window, he flings it open and scolds the bird for staying away so long. He explains that he had heard crows migrate during winter and feared Blackie had left him behind for good. Remembering something important, he tells the crow to wait right there while he fetches walnuts he had been saving. As he dashes off, a narrator's voice notes that the crow appears to have recovered considerably since they first met. A memory surfaces of when the boy first encountered the injured creature, recalling how it had cried constantly back then, its eyes swollen from endless tears. He chuckles to himself, admitting he must have looked quite gloomy earlier when the crow found him. Still, he reflects, it's a relief that the young duke isn't frightened of crows the way some might expect. Lying comfortably on the floor beside the bird, he begins sharing his thoughts about Talon, mentioning quietly that thanks to the crow, he has been able to explore the ducal house and gather bits of useful information along the way. He continues, explaining that Talon constantly warns him against wandering off, yet he genuinely wants to visit the area near the temple where the poor people live. The crow pecks curiously at a nut on the ground as he speaks. Without warning, the bird suddenly takes flight, wings flapping rapidly as it rises into the air. Startled, the boy reaches out instinctively, calling Blackie's name in surprise. He questions aloud whether the crow is already leaving, disappointment clear in his voice as he watches it soar toward the open window. Frustration creeps into his expression as he points out that they had barely gotten the chance to talk. He wonders why the bird insists on leaving so early today, of all days. A flicker of vulnerability crosses his face as an unfinished thought escapes him, admitting that if even Blackie leaves him now, he doesn't quite know what he would do. The crow taps twice against the windowsill, watching the boy with a steady gaze. He straightens up, stretching his sore knees, and asks Blackie whether his family must be waiting outside for him as well. Pushing the window wide open, he ushers the bird forward, telling it to hurry along. He promises they'll talk again the next time Blackie decides to visit. As the crow flaps upward into the open sky, he waves after it, shouting that it absolutely has to come back. The bird grows smaller against the clouds, disappearing into the distance beat by beat. From high above, the grand domes of the estate stretch out below, catching the light and looking magnificent from a distance. Despite the beauty, something about the scene feels quietly unsettling to the creature soaring past it. A young man reflects on a phrase that had lodged itself in his mind, repeating the words about wanting to see where the poor people live. His expression carries a mixture of amusement and concern as he turns the thought over. Watching the crow cut across the sky beneath a crescent moon, he murmurs that it seems things have finally begun. He admits he hadn't expected to hear those particular words so soon. Turning his attention toward the horizon, he acknowledges that the day he must start watching over the young duke is fast approaching. He recalls that the boy is a character who never even appears by name within the original novel. Leaning over a railing with a small, knowing smile, the boy remains unaware of the truth hanging over him. According to the story's fate, he is destined to die shortly after the hunting festival takes place.